Some things that sink are not meant to stay down. Great Bay is not a bay in the traditional sense. It is a tidal estuary, fed by 7 rivers, sprawling across nearly 10,000 acres of brackish water and mudflat along New Hampshire's narrow seacoast. The water is shallow in most places, rarely deeper than 15 feet, and the tides here swing dramatically, exposing miles of seafloor twice daily before swallowing them again. The bay is old, older than the towns that ring it. The Abenaki called it a place of returning, though colonial records never clarified what exactly was meant to return. The town of Newington sits on the bay's western edge. It is small, quiet, and largely industrial now, but in the early 70s it still had a working waterfront, lobster boats, clam diggers, a handful of families who had fished the estuary for generations. The water was familiar to them. They knew its moods, its channels, its tendency to hold fog for days. What they did not know, what no one knew, was what the bay had been hiding beneath its silted floor. On March 9, 1973, a 32-foot wooden fishing boat named Althea Gray departed from the Adams Point boat ramp at approximately 6:15 in the morning. Her captain was a 54-year-old lobsterman named Donald Fitch. He was alone. The weather was calm, the tide outgoing. By 7:40, Fitch had radioed the Portsmouth Harbor Coast Guard station to report a mechanical issue. His engine had begun to stall intermittently. He gave his position as just north of Nanny Island in the Central Channel. At 8:03, a Coast Guard patrol boat observed the Althea Gray listing sharply to starboard. Within minutes, she went down. The guardsmen reached the site within 12 minutes. They found no wreckage, no debris, no sign of Donald Fitch. A diver was dispatched that afternoon. Visibility was poor, but the bottom was surveyed. The boat was not there. The file was closed within 6 weeks. Fitch was presumed drowned. His widow received a death certificate dated April 19, 1973. His name was added to the memorial wall at the Rye Harbor Fishing Cooperative. The Althea Gray was listed as lost at sea. 14 months later, in the bitter cold of January 1974, a group of ice fishermen on the northern edge of Great Bay reported something impossible. The Althea Gray had returned. The first to see it was a man named Terence Ouellette, a pipe fitter from Dover who had been fishing through the ice near Ferber Strait. He described the vessel as halfway out of the ice, like it had been pushed up from underneath. The stern was submerged, the bow rose at a sharp angle, encased in frozen slush. The hull was intact. The name was clearly visible: Althea Gray, Newington. Ouellette did not approach the boat. He walked back to his truck and drove to the nearest payphone, where he called the New Hampshire Marine Patrol. Officers arrived within the hour. Their report, filed January 14, 1974, confirms the vessel's identification by registration number. The hull matched the records of the Althea Gray exactly, but something was wrong. According to the Marine Patrol's assessment, the boat showed no signs of having spent 14 months underwater. The paint was intact. The wood was dry above the waterline. The brass fittings, though cold, were not corroded. One officer noted that the vessel appeared recently maintained, despite having been documented sinking in full view of the Coast Guard less than a year and a half prior. The cabin was empty. No equipment, no logbook, no personal effects. The engine compartment had been stripped, not damaged but methodically emptied, as if someone had removed every component by hand. Teresa Fitch, Donald's widow, was contacted. She declined to visit the site, but confirmed that her husband had never recovered the boat and no insurance claim had ever been paid. She asked only one question, according to the report: "Is he in it?" He was not. The Althea Gray was towed to a boatyard in Portsmouth and placed in dry storage while authorities attempted to determine what had happened. Coast Guard officials reviewed the original sinking report. Divers returned to the coordinates near Nanny Island. Again, they found nothing. No wreckage, no engine block, no anchor. The seafloor was undisturbed. A marine surveyor named Harold Proul was brought in to examine the vessel. His written assessment, dated February 2, 1974, is one of the strangest documents in New Hampshire maritime records. Proul noted that the wood grain of the hull appeared significantly less weathered than expected for a vessel of its documented age. He estimated the boat's construction date, based on material analysis, as approximately 1969 or 1970. The Althea Gray had been built in 1951. Proul requested a second opinion. None was provided. The boat remained in storage for 3 years. In 1977, it was quietly sold at auction to a private buyer in Maine. The new owner renamed it and used it for recreational purposes until 1984, when it was reportedly destroyed in a fire at a Booth Bay Harbor marina. The case was closed. The file was archived. Great Bay returned to its rhythms. Then, in November of 2003, a kayaker near Adams Point reported a half-submerged vessel drifting in the shallows east of the old boat ramp. The hull was wooden, 32 feet. The stern had been repainted, but the original name was still visible beneath the newer coat, Althea Gray. New Hampshire Fish and Game responded. The registration number matched, the measurements matched. But the boat had been destroyed 19 years earlier, 300 miles away, in a fire that had been investigated and documented by Maine's Office of the State Fire Marshal. This time, the hull showed significant age. The wood was waterlogged and splintered. Barnacles clung to the keel. Rot had set into the transom. A marine biologist consulted by Fish and Game estimated the vessel had been submerged for at least 30 to 40 years. The boat was removed from the water and examined at the University of New Hampshire's Jackson Estuarine Laboratory. Core samples were taken from the hull. The results were never formally published, but a summary was included in an internal university memo dated January 6, 2004. It stated that the wood samples were consistent with white oak harvested in the late 1940s, matching the original construction records of the Althea Gray, but that the cellular degradation pattern suggested the boat had been aging in reverse for an indeterminate period before resuming normal decay. The phrase was not explained. No follow-up study was conducted. The memo was flagged as preliminary and never referenced again. Today, the remains of the Althea Gray sit in a fenced storage lot behind a marine salvage company in Newmarket. The owner, who asked not to be named, says he purchased the wreck in 2005 from a state surplus auction. He has never tried to restore it. He has never moved it. "It's not worth anything," he said in a 2019 interview with a regional podcast. "But I don't want to get rid of it either. I can't explain why. It just feels like it's waiting." Great Bay continues to rise and fall with the tides. Fishermen still work its channels. Tourists still kayak its inlets. The Abenaki stories have mostly been forgotten, though a few elders in the region still decline to fish near Nanny Island. No one has ever explained how a boat that sank in 1973 appeared frozen in ice in 1974, looking newer than the day it was built. No one has explained how a boat that burned in 1984 appeared again in 2003, rotted and barnacled, as if it had been underwater for half a century. The registration number has never been reissued. The file remains open, technically, but no one is assigned to it. In the university's archived memo, there is a handwritten note in the margin. It is unsigned. It reads, "Third time." The Althea Gray has not been seen since 2003, but the bay is patient, and the tide always comes back in. There are objects that refuse to be moved. Jaffrey Point is a narrow spit of land extending into the mouth of the Piscataqua River, where New Hampshire's coastline makes its brief appearance before yielding to Maine. The point is less than 2 miles long, a mix of rocky shore, salt marsh, and private estates that have belonged to the same families for generations. The water here is treacherous, strong tidal currents, shifting sandbars, and a history of shipwrecks dating back to the 1600s. But the interior of the point is quiet. Gentle hills, old stone walls, meadows that have been hayed for 3 centuries. It is not a place where you would expect to find a ship's anchor. The land at the center of Jaffrey Point rises to a modest elevation, approximately 63 feet above mean high tide, according to United States Geological Survey maps. The soil is dense glacial till, packed with cobblestones and clay. In the 1920s, a farmer named Obed Marston attempted to dig a root cellar on his property near the hilltop. He abandoned the project after striking what he described in a letter to his brother as ironwork of considerable size, standing upright like a grave marker. Marston did not investigate further. He filled in the hole, moved his cellar site 40 yards east, and never spoke of it publicly. The letter was discovered in 1987 among family papers donated to the Portsmouth Athenaeum. But Obed Marston was not the first to find it, and he would not be the last. In June of 1961, a construction crew working on a new septic system for a summer cottage on Jaffrey Point struck metal approximately 4 feet below the surface. The foreman, a man named Vincent Garrity, initially assumed it was an old plow blade, or perhaps a buried piece of farm equipment. He instructed his crew to dig around it. What they uncovered was a wrought iron ship's anchor, standing perfectly vertical in the earth, its flukes pointing downward, its shank rising toward the surface. The anchor measured just over 7 feet in total length. The ring at the top was intact. The iron was heavily corroded but structurally sound. Garrity stopped work and contacted the property owner, a retired professor from Boston named Eleanor Kimball. She, in turn, contacted the New Hampshire Division of Historical Resources. An archaeologist named Samuel Torrance was dispatched to examine the find. Torrance spent 3 days at the site. His report, filed July 19, 1961, remains in the division's archives. He noted several anomalies. First, the anchor was not lying flat, as one would expect from an object that had been buried or discarded. It was standing upright, perfectly plumb, as if it had been deliberately planted. Second, there was no evidence of a pit or disturbance around the anchor. The surrounding soil appeared undisturbed, compacted in layers consistent with centuries of natural settling. Third, the anchor's design was consistent with early 18th century English maritime manufacture, predating the oldest recorded structures on Jaffrey Point by at least 40 years. Torrance concluded that the anchor had likely been placed as a marker or monument, possibly by early settlers, though he admitted he could find no historical record of such a practice in the region. He recommended the anchor be excavated and transferred to the state's collection for preservation. The excavation was completed on August 2, 1961. The anchor was transported to a storage facility in Concord. On August 5, 3 days later, Eleanor Kimball telephoned the Division of Historical Resources. The anchor, she reported, was back. Vincent Garrity confirmed it. He had returned to the property to complete the septic installation and found the anchor standing in the same position, in the same hole, as if it had never been moved. The soil around it was undisturbed. There were no tire tracks, no footprints, no indication that anyone had visited the site. The state archaeologist's office assumed a prank, perhaps local teenagers or a disgruntled worker. The anchor in Concord was examined. It was still there, locked in storage. Staff photographed it, documented its registration number, and confirmed its presence. But the anchor on Jaffrey Point was also real, and when examined, it was identical, same dimensions, same corrosion patterns, same tool marks on the shank. A metallurgist from the University of New Hampshire was consulted. He declined to issue a formal opinion, but noted privately that the two anchors appeared to be the same object, though he could not explain how that was possible. Eleanor Kimball requested that the second anchor be removed. It was on August 12, 1961. This time, it was transported to a secure warehouse in Manchester and placed under lock with a signed chain of custody. On August 15th, the anchor was back on Jaffrey Point. The hole had not been redug, the soil had not been disturbed. The anchor simply stood there, as it always had, flukes down, ring up, waiting. The Division of Historical Resources closed its file on the Jaffrey Point anchor in September of 1961. The official explanation was, inconclusive origin, recommend no further action. The anchor in Manchester was eventually transferred to a maritime museum in Bath, Maine, where it remains on display as a colonial-era anchor of unknown provenance. The anchor on Jaffrey Point was left in place. Eleanor Kimball died in 1978. Her cottage passed to a nephew who visited rarely and spoke to neighbors even less. But in 1983, a local historian named Patricia Noonan conducted a series of interviews with longtime residents of the point for a project on regional folklore. Several mentioned the anchor. One man, a lobsterman named George Holloway, claimed his grandfather had seen the anchor in 1904, standing in the same meadow in the same position. Another resident, a woman named Frances Delacroix, said her family had owned land adjacent to the site in the 1880s and that her great-aunt had referred to the anchor as the nail. She said it held something down, Delacroix told Noonan. She never said what. Noonan attempted to trace the anchor's history further back, but found no written records before 1923. She did, however, locate a hand-drawn map from 1789 in the New Hampshire State Archives. It depicted the Jaffrey Point area and included a small symbol near the center of the point, an inverted triangle with a circle at the top. The symbol was unlabeled. Its meaning was not explained. The map's cartographer was a surveyor named Josiah Wheelwright. His notes, preserved in a separate file, make no mention of the symbol. But Noonan noticed something else. Wheelwright's survey listed the elevation of the hilltop as 63 feet. The current USGS measurement is identical. The anchor stands at the highest point on the entire peninsula. In 2009, the property changed hands again. The new owners, a couple from Connecticut, were unaware of the anchor's history until they began clearing brush near the meadow and found it standing in the tall grass. They assumed it was a decorative installation by a previous owner. They hired a landscaping company to remove it. The crew used a small excavator to dig around the base and a chain hoist to lift it free. The anchor was transported to a scrap metal dealer in Rochester. 4 days later, it was back. The landscaping company's foreman, a man named Derek Sutherland, refused to return to the property. In a 2011 interview with a paranormal investigation podcast, he said he had personally watched the anchor loaded onto a flatbed trailer. He had signed the delivery receipt. He had seen it leave. "I don't know how it got back," he said. "I don't want to know. Some things aren't supposed to be moved." The current owners have left the anchor in place. They have built a low wooden fence around it, as if it were a garden feature. They do not discuss it with visitors. A recent satellite image shows the meadow clearly, the anchor's shadow visible as a thin dark line against the grass. No ship has ever been recorded wrecking within 5 miles of Jaffrey Point. No burial, no monument, no ceremony has ever been documented at the site. The anchor's origin remains unknown. Its composition is consistent with iron smelted in England between 1700 and 1740. But no matching anchor has ever been identified in maritime records. The hole it stands in has never been fully excavated. Archaeologists in 1961 dug to a depth of 6 feet and found nothing beneath the flukes but more compacted clay. But George Holloway's grandfather reportedly said something else about the anchor, something Patricia Noonan recorded but did not include in her final paper. He said the anchor was longer once. He said it used to go down much, much further, and that someone or something had been pulling it up inch by inch for as long as anyone could remember. The cold does not always come from the air. Wentworth Marina sits on the southern bank of the Piscataqua River, tucked into a small cove where the current slows and the water deepens enough for working boats to moor year-round. In the 1970s, it was a modest operation. 18 slips, a fuel dock, a small office with a potbelly stove that the harbor master kept burning from October through April. The marina served mostly lobstermen and a handful of commercial fishermen who worked the coastal waters between the Isles of Shoals and Cape Ann. Portsmouth winters are cold, but not unusually so. The river rarely freezes completely, the tidal exchange keeps the water moving, and the salt content lowers its freezing point. February of 1977 had been mild by local standards. No significant snowfall, no ice storms. The National Weather Service station at Pease Air Force Base recorded overnight lows between 32 and 38 degrees for the entire first week of the month. It was not the kind of cold that kills. Yet on the morning of February 3rd, the harbor master, a 61-year-old Navy veteran named Albert Coffin, arrived at the marina just after 6 o'clock and found 5 men dead on 3 different boats. They were frozen. The first vessel Coffin checked was the Sea Mist, a 40-foot trawler owned by a father and son team named Roland and Peter Bergeron. Both men were seated in the wheelhouse. Roland was in the captain's chair, his hands on the wheel. Peter sat on the bench beside him, holding a thermos. Their skin was white, rigid, coated in a thin layer of frost. Their eyes were open. Coffin would later tell investigators that he thought at first they were mannequins. They didn't look real, he said. They looked like they'd been carved out of ice. He found the next body on the Dorothy Ann, a lobster boat moored 2 slips down. Her captain, a 53-year-old man named William Tessia, was sitting on an overturned bait bucket near the stern, his hands resting on his knees. He was frozen in the same manner, rigid, frosted, eyes open, skin the color of candle wax. The final 2 were aboard the Northern Light, a gill netter owned by a pair of brothers named Marcus and Stephen Gagnon. Marcus was found in the cabin, seated at the small galley table with a mug of coffee in front of him. Stephen was on deck, kneeling beside a coil of rope, his hands positioned as if he had been tying a knot. All 5 men were dead, all 5 were frozen solid, and all 5 had been seen alive the previous evening. Wamsizek out of the coffin called the Portsmouth Police Department at 6:22. Officers arrived within 15 minutes. By 7:30, the New Hampshire Medical Examiner's office had been notified, and by noon, the bodies had been transported to the state morgue in Concord. The autopsies were conducted over the following 3 days by Dr. Helen Ostrowski, the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner. Her findings were unusual enough that she requested a second opinion from a forensic pathologist at Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center. Both physicians reached the same conclusion. The men had not died of hypothermia. Their core body temperatures at the time of discovery were consistent with being frozen, approximately 12 degrees Fahrenheit internally, but there was no physiological evidence of cold exposure, no frostbite progression, no ice crystal formation in the blood vessels, no cellular damage consistent with gradual freezing. Dr. Ostrowski noted that the freezing appeared to have occurred instantaneously, as if the men had been flash frozen where they sat. More troubling was the estimated time of death. Based on gastric contents, rigor patterns, and other indicators, Ostrowski determined that all 5 men had likely died sometime between 11 o'clock on the evening of January 31st and 2 o'clock in the morning on February 1st. That was 72 hours before their bodies were discovered, but multiple witnesses had seen them alive on the evening of February 2nd. Albert Coffin himself had spoken to Roland Bergeron at approximately 5:15 on February 2nd. They had discussed the weather and an upcoming engine repair. Coffin described Bergeron as normal, tired maybe, but normal. A waitress at the Black Dog Tavern, a woman named Lucille Fontaine, served William Tessier a bowl of chowder and a beer at approximately 6:30 the same evening. She remembered because he had left a $5 tip on a $4 tab. He seemed fine, she said. Quiet, but he was always quiet. The Gagnon brothers had been seen at a gas station on Route 1A at approximately 7:45, filling portable fuel cans. The attendant, a teenager named Ronald Weeks, recalled that Stephen Gagnon had complained about the price of diesel. These sightings were documented in the police report. None of the witnesses wavered in their accounts. None had any reason to lie. Yet the medical evidence was unambiguous. The men had been dead for 3 days. The Portsmouth Police Department consulted with the Coast Guard, the State Police, and eventually the FBI's field office in Boston. No explanation was offered. No suspects were identified. The case was classified as death by undetermined means and effectively closed within 6 months. But the file contained several details that were never released to the public. First, the boats themselves. All 3 vessels showed signs of unusual ice accumulation on their interior surfaces, not frost, but solid ice, formed in patterns that one investigator described as geometric. The ice was thickest near the bodies and thinned toward the edges of each cabin. Samples were collected, but the lab analysis found nothing unusual. It was ordinary frozen seawater. Second, the clocks. Every timepiece on all 3 boats had stopped at the same moment, 1:47. The wall clock in the Sea Mist wheelhouse, the wristwatch on Roland Bergeron's arm, the small travel alarm in the Dorothy Ann cabin, the dashboard clock on the Northern Light, all frozen at 1:47. The date indicators, where present, showed February 1st. Third, the logbooks. Each captain maintained a daily log as required by their commercial licenses. The logs for January 31st and February 1st were present and appeared routine. But the pages for February 2nd were blank in all 3 books, not torn out, not missing, simply never written on, as if the day had not happened. Dr. Ostrowski included a handwritten note in her autopsy file, separate from the official report. It was discovered in 2016 when the state digitized its cold case archives. The note read, "Subjects appear to have experienced instantaneous thermal extraction, unclear mechanism. No natural or artificial process matches observed tissue state. Recommend consultation with specialized physics or engineering personnel." There is no record that such a consultation ever occurred. Wentworth Marina closed in 1984, a casualty of declining fish stocks and rising insurance costs. The property was sold to a developer who built condominiums on the site. The docks were removed. The cove was dredged and reshaped. But the story persisted among the older fishing families of Portsmouth. Some refused to moor in the cove even before the marina closed. Others spoke of a cold spot in the river near the old slips, a place where the water temperature dropped suddenly and inexplicably, even in summer. In 1991, a recreational diver named Thomas Hartigan reported an unusual experience while exploring the cove. He described a sudden, intense drop in water temperature and a sensation of pressure as if something were pushing him toward the surface. His dive computer, he claimed, recorded a temperature of 28 degrees Fahrenheit at a depth of 15 feet, well below the freezing point of seawater, yet the water remained liquid. Hartigan surfaced immediately and did not dive the site again. Lucille Fontaine, The waitress who served William Tessier his last meal gave an interview to a local newspaper in 2003, shortly before her death. She had carried a detail with her for 26 years, something she had not mentioned to police at the time because it seemed too strange. When Tessier left the Black Dog Tavern that night, she had followed him out to return his forgotten gloves. He was standing at the edge of the parking lot, looking toward the water. She called his name. He turned. His breath didn't fog, she said. It was February, 30-some degrees. Everyone's breath was fogging, but not his. It was like there was no warmth in him at all. She handed him the gloves. He thanked her. His voice, she said, sounded distant, like it was coming from very far away. 3 days later, or 72 hours earlier, depending on which evidence you trust, William Tessier was found frozen solid on the deck of the Dorothy Ann, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes open to a morning he should not have lived to see. The case remains unsolved. The cove remains quiet. And on certain February nights, fishermen in Portsmouth still speak of the cold that comes from nowhere, the kind that settles into your bones before you even notice the temperature has changed. Some sounds are not meant to be followed. Rye Ledge is a submerged granite ridge approximately 1.5 miles off the coast of Rye, New Hampshire, running roughly northeast to southwest for nearly 3/4 of a mile. The ledge rises from a seafloor depth of about 60 feet to within 12 feet of the surface at its shallowest points, making it a navigational hazard that has claimed at least 14 documented vessels since the 1700s. The water above the ledge is cold, murky with particulate from the nearby river outflows, and subject to strong currents that shift unpredictably with the tides. It is not a place recreational divers frequent. The visibility is poor, the currents are dangerous, and there is the sound. The earliest written account comes from a lobsterman named Ezekiel Philbrick, whose journal entry from September 14, 1892, describes an unusual experience while hauling traps near the ledge. Heard a whistling from below, he wrote. Not wind, not whale, steady and low, like a man blowing across a bottle, but deeper. Lasted perhaps 10 minutes. The boys heard it too. We left our traps and did not return for a week. Philbrick's account was dismissed as superstition by the few who read it. But over the following century, similar reports accumulated, scattered, informal, rarely documented, but remarkably consistent. The whistle comes only during slack tide, the brief window between the flood and ebb when the current stills and the water hangs motionless. It lasts between 8 and 15 minutes. It is low in pitch, rhythmic, and appears to originate from somewhere beneath the granite ledge itself. And those who hear it at close range, within the water, not from the surface, describe something else. They describe a pull. The first recorded disappearance occurred on August 7, 1931. A commercial diver named Frederick Arsenault was conducting salvage work on a fishing vessel that had struck the ledge and sunk in 18 feet of water. Arsenault was an experienced hard-hat diver who had worked the New England coast for over a decade. According to the surface tender's log, Arsenault descended at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, during what should have been a routine inspection of the wreck's hull. At 2:23, he reported hearing a low whistle, very clear. At 2:26, he requested additional slack on his air hose, stating he wanted to investigate a fissure in the rock approximately 40 feet east of the wreck. At 2:29, the tender lost communication. The air hose went taut, then slack. When the crew hauled it up, the end had been cleanly severed, not frayed, not torn, but cut, as if with a blade. Arsenault's body was never recovered. The fissure he mentioned was never located. The incident was ruled an accident, equipment failure perhaps, or an encounter with debris. But the tender, a man named Oscar Lindqvist, gave a statement to the Portsmouth Herald that was not included in the official report. "I heard it too," he said, "through the communication line, that whistle, and then Fred said something I couldn't make out. It sounded like, 'It's calling.' Then nothing." Lindqvist refused to work the ledge again. He left commercial diving within the year. The second disappearance occurred in 1958, the third in 1974. Both followed nearly identical patterns. In July of 1958, a marine biologist from the University of New Hampshire, named Dr. Constance Farnsworth, was conducting a survey of invertebrate populations on the ledge as part of a coastal ecosystem study. She was diving with a partner, a graduate student named Michael Rossiter. At approximately 11:40 in the morning, during slack tide, both divers reported hearing a pulsing, low-frequency tone through the water. Rossiter later described the experience in a departmental incident report. "It wasn't unpleasant," he wrote. "It was almost musical." Dr. Farnsworth signaled that she wanted to find the source. "I followed her for perhaps 20 meters along the base of the ledge. Then she descended into a crevice I hadn't noticed before. I tried to follow, but the opening was too narrow for my tank configuration. I waited. She did not return." Search efforts found no trace of Farnsworth. The crevice Rossiter described could not be located in subsequent dives. Sonar mapping of the ledge in 1961 showed no openings or fissures large enough to admit a diver. In August of 1974, a recreational scuba diver named Dennis Kowalski disappeared under similar circumstances. He was diving alone, against standard safety protocols, near the northern end of the ledge. His boat was found drifting with the anchor still down. His weight belt was recovered on the seafloor 2 days later, approximately 100 yards from the anchor point. His body was never found. A fisherman who had been working nearby that morning reported hearing something like a foghorn, but underwater, at approximately the time of Kowalski's estimated disappearance. "It went on for maybe 10 minutes, he said. Then it stopped. Then I saw his boat drifting." In 1986, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration conducted a routine acoustic survey of the New Hampshire coastal shelf as part of a marine mammal monitoring program. A hydrophone array was deployed approximately 200 meters southwest of Rye Ledge. On September 19th, during a slack tide window at 3:47 in the afternoon, the array recorded an anomalous signal. The recording, preserved in Norway's acoustic archive, runs for 11 minutes and 32 seconds. It has been analyzed by at least 4 independent acoustic laboratories over the past 3 decades. The sound is low frequency, between 14 and 18 hertz, at the threshold of human hearing. It is rhythmic, with a pulse interval of approximately 4.7 seconds. It does not match the acoustic signature of any known marine animal, geological process, or man-made source. One analyst noted that the harmonic structure was unusually complex and suggested the possibility of multiple overlapping sources. But the most unusual finding was the apparent origin point. Based on the array's directional data, the sound appeared to emanate from approximately 40 feet below the seafloor, from within the granite bedrock of the ledge itself. NOAA classified the recording as unexplained biological or geological acoustic event and did not conduct follow-up research. The file was archived and largely forgotten until a graduate student rediscovered it in 2012 while researching ambient ocean noise. She played the recording at a departmental seminar. Several attendees reported feeling uneasy or disoriented while listening, though the sound was well below the threshold of conscious perception when played through standard speakers. One professor left the room midway through the playback. He later declined to explain why. Local fishermen have their own theories. Some say the ledge sits above an underwater cave system that has never been mapped. Others believe the granite contains pockets of trapped gas that release periodically, creating the whistle effect. A few, mostly older men who remember the stories their fathers told, say the sound is older than the ledge itself, that it was there before the rock, before the sea, and that it is patient. A lobsterman named Arthur de Rosier, who has worked the waters around Rye for over 40 years, spoke to a regional podcast in 2019 about his experiences near the ledge. "I've heard it maybe 6-7 times over the years," he said, "always at slack tide, always that same low whistle. You feel it more than hear it, really, in your chest, in your teeth. And there's this pull, like something wants you to come closer. I never have. I haul my traps and I leave." When asked why he continues to fish near the ledge despite the stories, de Rosier's was quiet for a moment. "The lobsters are good there," he said. "Best on the coast. They cluster around the ledge like they're drawn to it. Fat, healthy, more than you'd expect. I don't know why. I don't ask." The University of New Hampshire has declined requests to conduct further research on the site. The Coast Guard has issued no formal warnings about the area, though local diving clubs have informally advised members to avoid the ledge during slack tide. The 3 missing divers remain listed as presumed drowned, their cases closed. But the recordings persist. The NOAA file has been downloaded over 12,000 times since it was digitized and made publicly accessible in 2015. Online forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena have analyzed it extensively, slowing it down, speeding it up, isolating frequencies. Some claim to hear patterns, others claim to hear words. One analysis, posted anonymously in 2017, slowed the recording to 1/4 speed and applied a frequency shift to bring it into the range of normal human hearing. The result was a sound that several listeners described as resembling a human voice, not speaking, but calling. A single, repeated syllable, rising and falling with the rhythm of the whistle. The analysts did not identify what the syllable was. They deleted their account 3 days after posting and have not resurfaced. Rye Ledge remains where it has always been, a spine of ancient granite just beneath the surface, waiting for the tide to still. The whistle continues. Fishermen hear it and move on. Divers hear it, and, if they are wise, ascend. But somewhere in the archives, in the acoustic files and the incident reports and the faded journals of men long dead, there is a question that no one has answered. If the sound comes from beneath the rock, from 40 feet below the seafloor, from a place that should be solid stone, what is making it? And what happens to those who find out? Fire consumes. That is its nature. But there are things that fire refuses to touch. The Portsmouth Naval Shipyard sits on Seavy's Island in the Piscataqua River, straddling the border between New Hampshire and Maine. Despite its name, the facility lies primarily within the town of Kittery, Maine, though its New Hampshire address has persisted since its founding in 1800. The shipyard is one of the oldest continuously operating naval installations in the United States, and during the Second World War, it was among the most critical, building and repairing submarines at a pace that helped turn the tide in the Atlantic. In March of 1943, the shipyard employed over 20,000 workers. 3 shifts operated around the clock. Security was tight, but imperfect, strained by the sheer volume of personnel and material flowing through the gates. Warehouses lined the western edge of the island, holding everything from engine components to medical supplies to classified equipment awaiting installation. Warehouse 7 was one of the older structures, a timber-framed building dating to the 1910s. It stored miscellaneous cargo, items in transit, overflow from other facilities, and materials awaiting inspection or disposal. On the night of March 17, 1943, Warehouse 7 caught fire. The cause was never definitively established. The official report cited probable electrical fault, though witnesses described the fire as starting simultaneously in multiple locations. By the time the shipyard fire brigade responded, the building was fully engulfed. The flames spread to adjacent structures. Within 2 hours, 11 buildings had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair. 4 men died. 19 others were injured. The material losses were estimated at over $2 million, a staggering sum at the time. But when investigators sifted through the wreckage the following morning, they found something that should not have been there. In the center of what had been Warehouse 7, surrounded by ash and twisted metal and the charred remains of hundreds of crates, sat a single wooden container. It was approximately 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 3 feet tall. It was constructed of plain pine, held together with iron bands. It was not burned, it was not scorched, it was not even warm. Lieutenant Commander Harold Bickford, the officer who led the initial damage assessment, noted the anomaly in his report. Crate appears untouched by fire, despite being located at apparent origin point of conflagration, he wrote. No soot accumulation, no heat damage to wood or metal fittings, contents unknown, manifest lists item as material, origin unknown, consignment 7-X. No further documentation available. Bickford ordered the crate removed to a secure storage area pending investigation. 2 enlisted men attempted to lift it. They could not. Despite its modest size, the crate would not move. Additional personnel were summoned. 6 men working together managed to slide it onto a hand truck, though all later reported that the weight seemed to shift as they worked, as if something inside was resisting. The crate was transported to a secure warehouse on the eastern side of the island. Bickford requested permission to open it. Permission was denied. Within 48 hours, a team from the Office of Naval Intelligence arrived at the shipyard. They interviewed Bickford, the fire brigade captain, and the enlisted men who had moved the crate. All interviews were classified. The crate was loaded onto a covered truck and removed from the facility. Bickford's report was amended. The reference to the undamaged crate was removed. The revised document made no mention of consignment 7-X. The story might have ended there, buried in the classified files of a wartime bureaucracy, if not for a pattern that emerged over the following decades. In November of 1951, a fire destroyed a storage annex at the Naval Supply Depot in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. The facility handled logistics for the Atlantic Fleet, processing thousands of shipments monthly. The fire was attributed to a faulty heating unit. Damage was extensive but contained, no fatalities. Among the items recovered from the debris was a wooden crate, approximately 4 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, constructed of pine with iron bands. It was undamaged. The manifest listed it as material, classification pending, transfer authorization 7X. The crate was removed by personnel from the Office of Naval Research within 72 hours. No further documentation exists in the depot's archives. In August of 1967, a warehouse fire at the Naval Weapons Station Earl in New Jersey killed 2 civilian contractors and destroyed an estimated $400,000 in equipment. Fire investigators noted an anomaly in their report. A single wooden crate, located near the center of the affected area, showed no fire damage whatsoever. The manifest reference was partially illegible, but appeared to include the designation 7X. The crate was removed before the investigation was complete. The reference was redacted from the final report. In February of 1984, a smaller fire broke out at a record storage facility in Arlington, Virginia, a building used primarily by the Department of Defense for archival material. The fire was contained quickly, damaging only a single storage room. Among the items in that room was a wooden crate matching the dimensions and construction of the previous incidents. It was unburned. A Freedom of Information Act request filed in 2009 sought records related to Consignment 7X or Transfer Authorization 7X. The request was denied on grounds of national security. An appeal was also denied. The denial letter stated that no responsive documents exist, though it did not explain how a non-existent file could be classified. Retired Navy personnel have occasionally spoken about the crate, though always off the record, and always with reluctance. A former supply officer named Raymond Gilchrist, who served at the Mechanicsburg Depot in the early 1950s, gave an interview to a military history researcher in 1997. The interview was never published, but a transcript was donated to a private archive after Gilchrist's death in 2008. "I saw them take it out," Gilchrist said. "The crate from the fire. I was on duty that night helping with the inventory of salvageable material. Everything else was black, ruined, falling apart. But that crate looked like it had just been built. Fresh wood, clean iron, not a mark on it." When asked if he knew what was inside, Gilchrist was quiet for a long moment. "Nobody opened it," he said. "I asked my CO about it once a few weeks later. He told me to forget I'd ever seen it, said it wasn't Navy, said it was older than the Navy. I didn't ask again." A similar account came from a civilian firefighter named Eugene Moreau, who worked the 1967 blaze at Earl. In a 2003 letter to his grandson, later shared on a military history forum, Moreau described the crate in detail. "It was cold," he wrote. "Everything else was hot, the metal, the concrete, even the ground. But that crate was cold. I touched it, I don't know why. It felt like touching a block of ice. And the smell, everything smelled like smoke except that box. It smelled like nothing, like absence. I've been in a lot of fires. I've never encountered anything like it." Moreau's letter did not describe the crate's removal, only that it was gone by morning. The most recent credible sighting occurred in 2001, though the circumstances remain murky. A former Defense Intelligence Agency analyst, speaking anonymously to an investigative journalist in 2014, claimed to have seen a reference to Cargo 7X in a classified briefing document related to the September 11th attacks. The reference was peripheral, a single line noting that certain materials had been relocated from a storage facility in the New York area as a precautionary measure on September 10th, one day before the attacks. The analyst did not claim to know what the cargo was. She did not claim a connection to the attacks. She said only that the designation caught her attention because of its age. "The file reference was from 1942, she said. "Whatever this thing is, we've been moving it around for over 60 years, and every time it shows up, something burns." No corroborating evidence has emerged. The journalist's article was never published. The analyst has not spoken publicly since. The Portsmouth Naval Shipyard continues to operate, though its mission has shifted from construction to maintenance and modernization. Warehouse 7 was never rebuilt. The site is now a parking lot, unmarked and unremarkable, filled with the cars of civilian employees who have no reason to know what once stood there. The manifest from March of 1943 lists 217 items stored in Warehouse 7. 216 were destroyed or damaged in the fire. One was not. And somewhere, in a facility that does not appear on any public record, a wooden crate sits in storage. Pine construction. Iron bands. Approximately 4 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. The contents remain unknown. The wood remains unburned. And the designation, 7X, remains classified 80 years after it first appeared in a shipyard fire report that no longer mentions it at all. Water remembers everything that passes through it. Almost everything. Great Bay is a tidal estuary fed by 7 rivers, spreading across nearly 10,000 acres of salt marsh, mudflat, and open water along New Hampshire's short coastline. It is shallow in most places, rarely deeper than 15 feet at high tide, and its channels shift with the seasons, rearranged by storms and ice and the slow accumulation of sediment. The bay has been fished, farmed, and navigated for over 400 years. Its waters are known. Its moods are familiar. But there is something on the bay that does not belong to it. The first documented sighting occurred on the night of October 14, 1963. A clam digger named Samuel Ouellette was working the flats near Adams Point shortly after midnight, using a lantern to spot the telltale holes in the mud. The tide was low and slack. The air was still. Ouellette later told investigators that he heard nothing, no engine, no oars, no splash, when he looked up and saw a boat passing less than 50 yards from where he stood. It was a wooden skiff, perhaps 14 feet long, with a single figure seated at the stern. The figure was dark, silhouetted against the faint glow of the western sky. Ouellette raised his lantern and called out, as was customary among those who worked the bay at night. The figure did not turn. The boat did not slow. What struck Ouellette was not the boat's silence. Small craft could move quietly on calm water. It was the water itself. There was no wake, he said in a statement to the New Hampshire Marine Patrol. No ripples. The boat moved across the surface like it wasn't touching it. And when I looked at the water where it had passed, it was flat, perfectly flat, like glass, like nothing had been there at all. Ouellette watched until the skiff disappeared into the darkness toward the mouth of the Lamprey River. He did not follow. He finished his work and went home. He did not return to the flats at night for 3 months. Over the following 2 decades, similar sightings were reported with irregular frequency, sometimes 2 or 3 in a single year, sometimes none for several years running. The witnesses varied: fishermen, kayakers, residents of waterfront homes, a state police officer conducting a routine patrol. The details were remarkably consistent. A small wooden skiff, unpainted or dark-hulled, moving at a steady pace across the water. A single occupant, always seated, never standing, never moving. No engine noise, no sound of oars, no wake, no reflection. The absence of reflection was noted by multiple witnesses independently. Margaret Holloway, who lived in a cottage overlooking the bay near Newington, reported a sighting in July of 1971. She had been sitting on her porch around 11 o'clock at night when she noticed movement on the water. The moon was nearly full, she told a reporter from the Portsmouth Herald. Everything had a reflection: the trees, the rocks, the channel markers, but not that boat. It moved across the moonlight like a shadow, like a hole in the water. Holloway retrieved binoculars and attempted to observe the occupant more closely. She described the figure as wearing dark clothing, possibly a coat or cloak with a shape that suggested a man, but could not be confirmed. The figure's face was not visible. It wasn't turned away from me, she said. I could see the front of it, where the face should have been, but there was nothing to see, just dark. The boat passed out of her field of vision within a few minutes. Holloway contacted the Marine Patrol the following morning. An officer noted her report, but took no further action. There had been no distress call, no collision, no crime. The first attempt to intercept the vessel occurred on September 3, 1978. Marine Patrol Officer Dennis Carpenter was conducting a routine evening patrol near the mouth of the Squamscott River when he observed a small craft matching the description of previous reports. It was approximately 9:45. The tide was incoming but slow. Visibility was good. Carpenter activated his spotlight and attempted to hail the vessel over his loudspeaker. There was no response. He increased his speed to close the distance. At approximately 200 yards, his engine stalled. His radio went dead. His spotlight flickered and failed. Carpenter later reported that every electrical system on his patrol boat ceased functioning simultaneously. By the time he managed to restart the engine, approximately 4 minutes later, the skiff had vanished. A search of the area found nothing, no boat, no debris, no sign of passage. Carpenter's incident report was filed, but not investigated further. The electrical failure was attributed to a possible fault in the boat's wiring harness. A second interception attempt occurred in August of 1984, conducted by two off-duty fishermen who had heard the stories and decided to investigate for themselves. Their account, given to a local historian in 1992, described a nearly identical experience. They spotted the skiff near Nanny Island, pursued it at low speed, and experienced a complete electrical failure at approximately 150 yards. Their engine died. Their running lights went dark. One of the men reported that his wristwatch had stopped. "It was like something just turned us off," he said. "And by the time we got everything working again, the boat was gone, not moving away, gone, like it had never been there." The third attempt occurred in 2005 and was conducted by the Coast Guard following a formal complaint filed by a recreational boater who had nearly collided with the skiff near Adams Point. The Coast Guard deployed a small patrol vessel equipped with modern electronics and night vision equipment. The pursuit lasted approximately 7 minutes. At a distance of roughly 100 yards, all electronic systems aboard the Coast Guard vessel failed simultaneously. The crew reported a sudden drop in temperature and a pressure in their ears, as if they had rapidly descended in altitude. By the time power was restored, the skiff had disappeared. The Coast Guard's official report attributed the incident to unexplained electromagnetic interference and recommended no further action. The case was closed. Last efforts to identify the vessel have proven fruitless. The New Hampshire Division of Motor Vehicles maintains no registration for any boat matching the description. Historical records have been searched for skiffs reported lost, stolen, or abandoned in the Great Bay Area. None match. Maritime historians have examined the described construction: wooden hull, approximately 14 feet, no visible engine or oarlocks, and suggested it could date to the late 19th or early 20th century. But no specific vessel has been identified. The occupant remains equally mysterious. Witnesses universally describe a single figure, seated, unmoving, facing forward. The figure does not respond to hails, lights, or horns. It does not turn its head. It does not gesture. Several witnesses have described a sense that the figure was aware of them, watching in some way, despite showing no visible reaction. "I felt seen," said Thomas Aldridge, a kayaker who encountered the skiff near Durham Point in 1997. "Not looked at, seen, like whatever was in that boat knew exactly where I was and what I was doing. But it didn't care. It just kept going." Aldridge reported that the encounter left him shaken for weeks. He sold his kayak the following month and has not returned to the water at night since. Local historians have searched for explanations rooted in the bay's long human history. Great Bay was a center of colonial shipbuilding, and dozens of small craft have been lost in its waters over the centuries. Several drownings have occurred in the estuary, though none correspond obviously to the sightings. Indigenous Abenaki stories speak of spirit boats that carry the dead across water, but these accounts are fragmentary and difficult to verify. One theory, proposed by a folklorist at the University of New Hampshire, suggests the sightings may be a form of collective memory, a cultural ghost story that has taken on the appearance of reality through repeated telling. But this theory does not account for the electrical failures experienced by those who have attempted pursuit, nor does it explain how witnesses with no prior knowledge of the phenomenon describe the same details. A marine biologist who asked not to be named offered a different perspective. "Water conducts electricity," she said. "It holds temperature. It transmits sound. It's a medium, and mediums can carry impressions. Maybe what people are seeing isn't a boat at all. Maybe it's something the water remembers, something that passed through it once and left a mark that never quite faded. She declined to elaborate on what might have created such an impression. The most recent sighting occurred in November of 2021. A couple walking along the shore at Wagon Hill Farm reported seeing a small boat drifting silently across the bay around 10:30 in the evening. They did not attempt to signal it. They did not call the authorities. "We'd heard the stories," the woman said in a social media post the following day. "We knew what it was, or what people say it is, and we just watched. It moved so slowly, so smoothly, and then it was gone. No sound, no ripples, just gone." She ended her post with a question that has been asked in various forms for nearly 60 years. Where does it go? Every night it moves across the water, but it never arrives anywhere. It never docks. It never stops. Where does a boat with no wake go when it disappears? No one has ever answered. The bay keeps its silence. And somewhere in the dark, on water that refuses to remember its passage, the skiff continues its journey, steady, slow, and utterly alone. Names are supposed to outlast us. That is the purpose of a headstone. The colonial cemetery of Hampton Falls lies on a gentle slope behind the town's original meeting house, which has long since been replaced by a white clapboard church built in 1847. The graveyard is small, perhaps 200 stones spread across less than an acre, and it holds the remains of families who settled this stretch of the New Hampshire seacoast in the late 1600s. The oldest legible marker dates to 1691. Many others have worn past reading, their inscriptions surrendered to weather and time and the slow dissolution of memory. One stone, however, has not worn down. It has changed. The marker stands in the northeast corner of the cemetery, partially shaded by an old oak that has grown around the iron fence line. It is made of local granite, roughly rectangular, approximately 3 feet tall and 18 inches wide. The craftsmanship is simple. No carved angels, no elaborate borders, just a flat face with space for a name, dates, and perhaps a brief epitaph. Cemetery records maintained by the town of Hampton Falls indicate that this plot was purchased in 1729 by a man named Elias Marsh for himself and his descendants. The records note that Marsh died in 1732 and was interred in the plot. No other burials are documented at that location, but no one has ever seen the name Elias Marsh on the stone. The earliest known photograph of the marker was taken in 1924 by a local historian named Dorothea Batchelder, who was compiling a survey of colonial-era grave sites in Rockingham County. Her photograph, preserved in the Hampton Falls Historical Society archives, shows the stone clearly. The name inscribed on it is Solomon Hartwell. The dates read, born 1847, died 1925. Batchelder noted the discrepancy in her field journal. Stone bears name of Solomon Hartwell, yet cemetery plot records attribute site to Elias Marsh, d. 1732. No Hartwell appears in Hampton Falls vital records. Possible error in documentation, or stone may have been moved or replaced at unknown date. She photographed the marker, made a rubbing, and continued her survey. Solomon Hartwell died on February 9, 1925, 4 months after Batchelder's visit. He was a carpenter from Exeter, 12 miles to the west. He had no known connection to Hampton Falls. His death certificate lists his place of burial as Exeter Cemetery, where a headstone bearing his name stands to this day. Yet in 1924, his name was already on a stone in Hampton Falls, along with the year of his death, a death that had not yet occurred. The second documented instance came in 1938. A gravestone restoration project undertaken by the Works Progress Administration included several Hampton Falls sites. A photographer named Louis Bellevaux was assigned to document the cemetery's condition. His photographs, archived at the New Hampshire State Library, show the northeast corner marker clearly. The name on the stone is Catherine Pelletier. The dates read born 1901, died 1939. Bellevaux's notes make no mention of the discrepancy with cemetery records. He may not have been aware of them. He photographed 63 stones that day and moved on to Seabrook the following morning. Catherine Pelletier was a school teacher in Manchester, New Hampshire. She died on October 3, 1939, in an automobile accident on Route 101. She had never visited Hampton Falls. She had no family in the Seacoast region. Her body was returned to Quebec, where she was buried in her family's parish cemetery. Her name appeared on the Hampton Falls stone a full year before her death. The pattern continued. In 1952, a graduate student from Boston University conducting genealogical research photographed the stone. The name had changed to Vernon Stokes, born 1919, died 1953. Vernon Stokes, a factory worker from Nashua, died of a heart attack in August of 1953. In 1967, a tourist photographed the stone while visiting relatives in the area. The name read Dorothy Massey, born 1930, died 1968. Dorothy Massey, a nurse from Concord, died in a house fire in March of 1968. In 1979, a local high school student photographed the cemetery for a history class project. The name had become Gerald Fontaine, born 1945, died 1980. Gerald Fontaine, an electrician from Portsmouth, died in a workplace accident in November of 1980. In 1994, a professional photographer hired by the Historical Society to update their archival images captured the stone bearing the name Margaret Horvath, born 1952, died 1995. Margaret Horvath, an accountant from Dover, died of cancer in September of 1995. In 2011, a paranormal investigation group obtained permission to document the cemetery at night using infrared photography. Their images show the stone clearly. The name reads David Arsenault, born 1968, died 2012. David Arsenault, a commercial fisherman from Rye, drowned when his boat capsized in January of 2012. 7 names, 7 deaths. Each name appearing on the stone months or years before the person died. Each person with no documented connection to Hampton Falls, to the cemetery, or to each other. Attempts to explain the phenomenon have proven futile. In 1971, following the emergence of the pattern in local folklore, the Hampton Falls Cemetery Commission ordered an examination of the stone. A stonemason named Robert Thibodeau was hired to assess whether the inscriptions had been recently carved or altered. Thibodeau's report, submitted to the town selectmen, stated that the visible inscription, at that time reading Gerald Fontaine, showed weathering consistent with at least several decades of exposure. The carving style, he noted, was consistent with 19th century techniques, not modern tools. There was no evidence of recent alteration, patching, or resurfacing. The name appears to have been on the stone for a very long time, Thibodeau wrote. I cannot explain how this is possible, given that the individual in question is, to my knowledge, still living. Gerald Fontaine was 34 years old at the time of the assessment. He would die 9 years later. In 1986, a geologist from the University of New Hampshire examined the stone as part of a study on granite weathering patterns in colonial cemeteries. Her analysis confirmed that the stone was local granite, likely quarried in the early 18th century. The inscription, she noted, showed differential weathering. The carved letters were slightly more eroded than the surrounding surface, suggesting they had been present for an extended period. She did not address the question of how the name could change. Her report focused solely on the physical properties of the stone. The Cemetery Commission has considered removing the marker on multiple occasions. Each time, the proposal has been rejected. In 1998, a motion to relocate the stone to a storage facility was voted down by the selectmen after several residents objected on historical preservation grounds. In 2008, a proposal to cover the stone with a protective housing was abandoned due to lack of funding. In 2015, a suggestion to simply turn the stone around, face inward, inscription hidden, was dismissed as insufficient. "What would be the point?" said one commission member, speaking anonymously to a regional newspaper. "The name would still be there, and we'd still know it was there, and whoever's name it is would still die." The current policy is to leave the stone undisturbed and to discourage public attention. The cemetery is open during daylight hours, but the northeast corner is not included in official walking tours. The Historical Society's website makes no mention of the marker. Photographs of the stone are difficult to find online. Several that were posted to social media over the years have been removed, some by the platforms, others by the users themselves. A thread on a paranormal forum discussing the marker was deleted in 2017. The user who started it posted a final message before the deletion. "I looked up the name on the stone. It's mine." The user's account went inactive shortly afterward. Efforts to contact them have been unsuccessful. No one knows who will be next. The stone has not been photographed to public knowledge since 2011. The Historical Society has declined requests from researchers and journalists. Local residents avoid the northeast corner of the cemetery. Even the gravestone restoration volunteers who maintain the other markers refuse to approach it. "I don't want to see it," said one volunteer, a retired teacher who has worked in the cemetery for over 15 years. "I don't want to know. My name could be on it right now. Your name could be on it. And if we look, we'll know. And then we'll have to wait." The cemetery records still list the plot as belonging to Elias Marsh, died 1732. His name has never appeared on the stone. Perhaps it never will. Perhaps Elias Marsh is not buried there at all. Perhaps the grave belongs to something else, something that has been collecting names for nearly 300 years. The oak tree in the corner has grown thicker. Its branches shade the stone more fully now than they did in 1924. In winter, when the leaves have fallen, the marker is visible from the church parking lot. In summer, it is hidden entirely. Most people in Hampton Falls prefer it that way. The stone stands where it has always stood, waiting for someone to look, waiting for someone to read, waiting to show them a name that should not be there, a name that belongs to someone who is still alive. For now. Ice does not choose how to preserve, but sometimes the dead choose how to stand. Lake Winnipesaukee is the largest body of water in New Hampshire, stretching over 70 square miles across the central part of the state. Its name, derived from the Abenaki language, has been translated variously as Smile of the Great Spirit or Beautiful Water in a High Place. The lake is deep in places, over 180 feet at its maximum, and its waters are cold even in summer. In winter, the ice can grow thick enough to support automobiles, and for generations the lake has drawn fishermen who cut holes in the frozen surface and wait for the perch and pickerel that swim below. The winter of 1887 to 1888 was one of the coldest on record in New England. January temperatures in the Winnipesaukee region dropped below -20 degrees Fahrenheit for 11 consecutive days. The ice grew to nearly 3 feet thick in the shallower bays. Snow drifted against the shoreline cottages. The lake became a white plain, silent and vast. On the morning of February 11th, 1888, a farmer named Horace Littlefield was crossing the ice near Moultonborough Bay, hauling a sledge of firewood to a neighbor's property. The sky was clear. The wind was still. Littlefield knew the lake well. He had fished it since childhood, and he noticed something wrong from nearly a quarter-mile away. 3 dark shapes stood on the ice, motionless, in the middle of the bay. Littlefield assumed at first they were tree stumps or debris from a collapsed ice shanty, but as he drew closer, the shapes resolved into forms he recognized. They were men, and they were standing. The 3 men were later identified as brothers, Josiah, Calvin, and Nathaniel Wentworth, ages 34, 31, and 28 respectively. They were fishermen from the town of Tuftonboro, on the eastern shore of the lake. They had left their home on the morning of February 9th to fish a spot near the center of Moultonboro Bay, approximately 2 miles from shore. They had not returned. Their families had assumed they had sheltered overnight in one of the ice shanties that dotted the lake during the fishing season. No alarm was raised until February 10th, when a neighbor noticed their sledge and equipment were still missing. A search party was organized but found nothing before darkness fell. Horace Littlefield found them the following morning. The 3 men stood in a triangular formation, each approximately 8 feet from the others, facing inward toward a central point. Their postures were identical, back straight, arms raised to chest height, palms facing outward, fingers splayed. Their eyes were open, their mouths were open, their skin was white with frost. They were frozen solid, standing upright on the surface of the ice. Littlefield did not approach immediately. He circled the formation at a distance of perhaps 20 yards, trying to understand what he was seeing. The ice beneath the men was clear, unusually clear, he noted, as if it had frozen without the bubbles and impurities common to lake ice. He could see the dark water below, and beyond that, the dim suggestion of the lake bottom. There was no fishing hole, no equipment, no sledge, no sign of how the men had reached this spot or what they had been doing when they died. Littlefield returned to shore and summoned help. By noon, a dozen men had gathered at the site. The county coroner, a physician named Dr. Alden Prescott, arrived by early afternoon. His examination, conducted on the ice before the bodies were moved, would later be described by colleagues as unprecedented in his 30-year career. The Wentworth brothers had not frozen to death in the conventional sense. Their clothing was dry, their skin showed no frostbite progression, no blistering, no discoloration, beyond the pallor of death. Their lungs, when later examined during autopsy, were filled with water. All 3 men had drowned. The cause of death is asphyxiation by submersion, Dr. Prescott wrote in his report. The presence of water in the lungs, trachea, and stomach is consistent with drowning. The absence of external ice trauma and the dry condition of clothing suggests the submersion occurred in liquid water, not through a break in the ice surface. How the deceased came to be standing upright on solid ice following death by drowning cannot be medically explained. The bodies were removed with considerable difficulty. The men's boots had frozen to the ice surface, and their postures were rigid, arms still raised. They had to be transported lying on their backs with their arms pointing toward the sky, a sight that reportedly disturbed the men who carried them. The Wentworth brothers were buried 3 days later in the Tuftonboro Cemetery. The funeral was attended by most of the town. No one spoke publicly about the circumstances of their death. Dr. Prescott's report was filed with the county clerk and largely forgotten, but certain details circulated among the families who lived on the lake, passed down through generations as a warning or a mystery. The formation. The 3 men had died, standing in a perfect equilateral triangle, each exactly 8 feet from the others. Measurements taken at the scene confirmed the precision. No natural circumstance could explain such positioning. The ice. Several witnesses noted that the ice within the triangle, the space the 3 men had faced, was different from the surrounding surface. It was darker, clearer, and appeared to extend deeper than the ice outside the formation. One man, a carpenter named Edwin Garland, claimed he saw movement in the water below the triangle. He described it as something passing beneath, slow and large. He refused to elaborate further. The arms, the raised hands, palms out, fingers spread, suggested a gesture of warding or protection. The men appeared to have died defending themselves against something in the center of their formation. But there was nothing there. Only ice, only water, only the dark, and the water in their lungs. Dr. Prescott noted in a private letter to a colleague that the water recovered from the men's airways was unusually cold, colder, he estimated, than the surrounding lake water should have been. He also noted an absence of biological material. Lake water typically contains microorganisms, sediment, plant matter. The water in the Wentworth brothers' lungs was, in his words, as clean as if it had been distilled. He offered no explanation. He asked his colleague not to share the letter. It was found among the colleague's papers after his death in 1907 and donated to the New Hampshire Historical Society, where it remains in the uncatalogued collection. Local theories emerged in the years following the incident. Some suggested the men had fallen through the ice, drowned, and somehow been pushed back to the surface by currents or gas pressure, freezing in place as they emerged. But this theory could not account for their upright posture, their precise formation, or the absence of any hole in the ice. Others proposed that the men had been murdered, drowned elsewhere, and positioned on the ice as a macabre display. But no motive was ever identified, and the logistics of transporting 3 frozen corpses to the center of the lake and standing them upright without leaving tracks in the snow seemed impossible. A few whispered older explanations. The Abenaki had stories about the lake, stories that were not often shared with outsiders, but occasionally surfaced in fragments. A trader named Clement Beausoleil, who had spent years among the Abenaki communities to the north, reportedly told a Tuftonboro minister in 1891 that the lake held something in its deepest places, something that had been there before the ice, before the water, before the land itself. He said the lake was not a lake, the minister wrote in his journal. He said it was a door, and sometimes the door opens from the other side. Beausoleil died in 1893. His papers, if any existed, have never been found. The site where the Wentworth brothers were found has never been marked, but locals know its approximate location. Fishermen avoid the area. Ice shanties are not built there. Even in summer, boaters tend to steer clear of Moultonborough Bay's deeper center. In 1932, a winter survey conducted by the state measured ice thickness across the lake. Most readings fell between 24 and 36 inches. At the approximate location of the 1888 incident, the surveyor recorded a reading of 14 inches, less than half the surrounding thickness. He noted the anomaly but offered no explanation. In 1978, a scuba diving club from the University of New Hampshire conducted a series of recreational dives in Lake Winnipesaukee as part of a summer training program. One dive, in Moultonborough Bay, was cut short when a diver named Sandra Kowalczyk surfaced in a state of panic. She reported that at approximately 60 feet, she had seen 3 shapes on the lake bottom, standing upright in the silt. They looked like men, she told the dive supervisor, standing in a triangle, facing each other. I swam closer, and they were just posts, old wooden posts. But for a second, I could have sworn they moved. The site was not re-examined. The dive club did not return to that location. The Wentworth brothers' graves remain in the Tuftonboro Cemetery, marked by 3 simple stones arranged in a row. The inscriptions list their names and dates, nothing more. No mention of how they died, no mention of how they were found. But older residents of the lake communities still tell the story on winter nights, when the ice groans and cracks in the darkness and the wind carries sounds that could be anything or nothing. They speak of the 3 men who went fishing and never came back, who were found standing on the ice in a perfect triangle, arms raised, mouths open, lungs full of water that had no explanation, who had drowned in a lake they never fell into, and who stood frozen in a posture of defense against something that left no trace. The ice that winter was clear enough to see through, clear enough to see the bottom, and those who looked said the bottom seemed very far away, farther than it should have been, farther than any measurement could account for, as if the lake, in that one spot, had no bottom at all. A ship cannot be in 2 places at once, but it can arrive from a place it never left. Portsmouth Harbor sits at the mouth of the Piscataqua River, where New Hampshire's brief coastline meets the Atlantic. It has been a working port for nearly 4 centuries, sheltering fishing boats, merchant vessels, and naval ships in its deep, protected waters. The harbor is well charted, well lit, and well traveled. In 1951, it was monitored by the Coast Guard, the harbor master's office, and a small but attentive community of fishermen and sailors who noticed everything that moved on the water. On the morning of August 14, 1951, they noticed something that should not have been there. The yacht Perseverance entered the harbor under full sail at approximately 7:15 in the morning. She was a wooden ketch 40 feet in length with a dark blue hull and white trim. Her sails were set correctly for the wind conditions. Her course was steady. She moved through the channel with the easy confidence of a vessel that knew exactly where it was going. The harbor master, a retired Navy officer named Kenneth Aldrich, watched her approach through binoculars from his office window. He noted her lines, her rigging, her overall condition. He did not see anyone on deck. Aldrich radioed a greeting. There was no response. He tried again. Silence. By the time the Perseverance reached the inner harbor, Aldrich had summoned 2 dock workers and a Coast Guard ensign who happened to be ashore on other business. Together they watched the yacht glide toward an empty slip as if guided by invisible hands. She came to rest against the dock pilings with barely a sound. Her sails luffed once, then hung limp as she lost way. The bowline, already coiled and ready on the foredeck, fell over the side as if placed there by someone who had departed moments before. No one was aboard. The Kenneth Aldrich was the first to step onto the Perseverance. He found her in immaculate condition. The deck was clean, the brass was polished, the lines were coiled with naval precision, the cabin was unlocked. Inside he found a bunk that had been recently slept in, a galley with provisions for several weeks, and a navigation table with charts spread open to the western Atlantic. The logbook was on the table, open to the most recent entry. According to the log, the Perseverance had departed Hamilton, Bermuda on July 28, 1951, bound for Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The entries were detailed and methodical, written in a steady hand. They recorded daily positions, weather conditions, sail changes, and observations about sea state. The final entry, dated August 13th, noted, "Fair winds, moderate seas, landfall expected tomorrow morning, all is well." The voyage described was unremarkable, a 17-day passage along a well-traveled route. The handwriting was consistent throughout. The entries showed no sign of distress, confusion, or interruption. But the Perseverance had not departed from Bermuda. Aldrich contacted the Royal Bermuda Yacht Club within hours of the vessel's arrival. Their records confirmed that the Perseverance had been moored in Hamilton Harbor continuously since September of 1948. The mooring fees had been paid through 1952 by an estate trust. The yacht had not moved. She had not been provisioned. She had not been boarded by anyone other than a maintenance worker who checked her bilge pumps quarterly. The Yacht Club's Commodore, a man named Jeffrey Harrington, sent a follow-up telegram the next day. He had personally inspected the Perseverance's assigned mooring that morning. The boat was still there. The owner of the Perseverance was a man named Theodore Stanwyck, a wealthy textile importer from Boston who had retired to a life of sailing in his early 50s. Stanwyck had purchased the yacht in 1945 and spent 3 years cruising the Caribbean and the eastern seaboard. He was known among the sailing community as a competent, cautious mariner. In August of 1948, Stanwyck departed Bermuda on a solo passage to Newport, Rhode Island. He was expected to arrive within 10 days. He never did. A search was conducted. No wreckage was found. No distress signal was received. Stanwyck was declared dead in absentia in February of 1949. His estate passed to a nephew in Philadelphia who had little interest in sailing and arranged for the Perseverance to remain in Bermuda under the Yacht Club's care until a buyer could be found. Theodore Stanwyck had been dead for 3 years when his yacht sailed into Portsmouth Harbor with a logbook full of entries in what experts later confirmed was his handwriting. The Coast Guard conducted a formal investigation. The logbook was examined by a document specialist from the Boston field office. The handwriting analysis was conclusive. The entries were written by Theodore Stanwyck. The ink was consistent with fountain pen use. The paper showed no signs of age manipulation, forgery, or chemical treatment. The dates on the entries corresponded to July and August of 1951, 3 years after Stanwyck's disappearance and presumed death. Investigators compared the 1951 log entries to Stanwyck's earlier writings, including personal letters and previous logbooks recovered from his Boston residence. The handwriting matched. The vocabulary matched. The nautical observations matched his known style and level of expertise. It is as if Theodore Stanwyck wrote these entries himself in real time during the voyage described, the specialist concluded in his report. I cannot reconcile this finding with the fact that Mr. Stanwyck has been deceased since 1948. The report was classified and not released to the public. A summary was provided to Stanwyck's nephew, who declined to claim the vessel. The Perseverance was impounded by the Coast Guard and placed in storage at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard pending further investigation. No further investigation was conducted. The yacht remained in storage for 18 months. In February of 1953, she was quietly auctioned to a marine salvage company from Portland, Maine. The new owners stripped her of valuable fittings and sold the hull to a boatyard in Kennebunkport, where she sat in a shed for another decade before being broken up for scrap in 1964. But the logbook survived. It passed through several hands over the years: a Coast Guard evidence locker, a regional archive, a private collector of maritime curiosities. In 1987, it was donated to the Maine Maritime Museum in Bath, where it remains in their collection of anomalous documents. It is not on public display. A researcher who examined the log in 2003 noted several details that had not been included in the original Coast Guard report. First, the daily positions recorded in the log were accurate. They described a plausible course from Bermuda to New Hampshire, with drift patterns and wind conditions that matched historical weather data for July and August of 1951. Whoever wrote the entries knew exactly where the boat should have been on each day of the voyage. Second, the provisions noted in the log matched what was found aboard the Perseverance when she arrived in Portsmouth, down to specific brands of canned goods and the quantity of fresh water remaining. The galley inventory was precise. Third, the log contained a reference that the Coast Guard had redacted from their report. The entry for August 11th, 3 days before arrival, included a brief notation: sighted vessel to starboard, no lights, no flag. Did not respond to hail. Appeared to be Perseverance. Must be mistaken. Theodore Stanwyck, or whoever wrote the log, had seen his own boat while sailing his own boat. The researcher, a doctoral candidate named Elizabeth Morin, attempted to locate Kenneth Aldrich for an interview in 2004. She learned that Aldrich had died in 1979, but his daughter, Margaret Aldrich Vance, was living in Dover, New Hampshire. Margaret agreed to speak about her father's experience. She had heard the story many times growing up, though her father rarely shared it with anyone outside the family. He never got over it, she said. Not the boat arriving by itself. He'd seen strange things at sea. What bothered him was the smell. Moran asked her to explain. When he went aboard, the cabin smelled like someone had just been there. Fresh coffee, tobacco smoke, soap. He said it smelled lived in, warm, but there was no one. And the coffee pot was empty. The stove was cold. There was no logical source for any of it. Margaret paused, then continued. He told me once that he stood in that cabin for a long time just breathing. He said it smelled exactly like a boat should smell after 17 days at sea with a man living aboard. He said it smelled like a voyage, a real voyage, one that had actually happened. She looked out the window toward the river, but it hadn't. That's what he couldn't accept. The boat was in Bermuda, the owner was dead, the voyage never happened, but the smell was there, the log was there, the boat was there. Everything was there, except an explanation. The mooring in Hamilton Harbor was finally sold in 1955. The Perseverance, the one that never moved, was towed to a shipyard and surveyed for potential sale. The surveyor noted that the yacht was in poor condition, her hull fouled with 3 years of marine growth, her rigging corroded, her sails mildewed beyond repair. She had clearly not moved in a very long time. She was broken up later that year, her timber sold for salvage. No log was found aboard, no provisions, no sign that anyone had visited her since Theodore Stanwyk's departure in 1948. 2 boats, one name, one in Bermuda, rotting at its mooring, one in Portsmouth, arriving under full sail with a cabin that smelled of coffee and a logbook filled with impossible entries. The voyage described in that log lasted 17 days. It covered over 1,000 nautical miles. It was recorded in meticulous detail by a man who had been dead for 3 years, sailing a boat that never left port toward a harbor he would reach without ever having departed. The Perseverance made her final landfall on August 14, 1951. No one has ever explained where she came from. The sea collects everything. Sometimes it sends things back. Odiorn Point is a rocky headland on the New Hampshire coast, jutting into the Atlantic just south of Portsmouth Harbor. It is the site of the state's first European settlement, a fishing station established in 1623, and its shoreline has witnessed 4 centuries of maritime activity, arrivals, departures, wrecks, and recoveries. The rocks are unforgiving. The currents are unpredictable. Ships that lose power or steering in the wrong place find themselves driven toward granite that has been breaking hulls since before anyone thought to keep records. On the morning of November 19, 1967, the trawler Margaret Louise joined that long list of casualties. She was a 65-foot steel-hulled vessel, built in 1952 for the New Bedford fishing fleet. Her registration had lapsed in 1963. Her last known owner, a man named Clarence Souza of Fairhaven, Massachusetts, had died in 1965. The boat had been reported as derelict and was believed to have been scrapped or sunk years earlier. Yet there she was, grinding against the rocks at Odiorn Point, her hull intact, her wheelhouse empty, her anchor chain dragging behind her like a forgotten leash. A park ranger named Donald Thibault was the first to reach her. The tide was low, and he was able to wade out to the vessel without significant difficulty. He climbed aboard expecting to find nothing, an empty shell, a ghost of the fishing industry that had built and abandoned her. What he found instead was 14,237 letters. The hold of the Margaret Louise had been converted at some point from a fish storage compartment to a cargo space. The refrigeration units were gone, the ice bins removed. In their place, stacked floor to ceiling in neat rows, were canvas mail sacks of the type used by the United States Postal Service. Thibault opened one of the sacks. It contained sealed envelopes, standard white business envelopes, each bearing a handwritten name and address, each stamped and postmarked. He examined several at random. The postmarks read, November of 1967. The stamps were current first-class issue. The addresses were locations throughout New England, the mid-Atlantic states, and as far south as the Carolinas. He did not open any of the letters. He climbed back to shore and contacted the Coast Guard. By noon, a team of investigators had arrived. The Margaret Louise was stabilized against the rocks, and the mail sacks were removed to a Coast Guard warehouse in Portsmouth for examination. The initial count took 3 days, 14,237 letters. No two were addressed to the same person. The first anomaly was discovered when investigators began attempting to notify the recipients. Every person to whom a letter was addressed had died at sea. The addresses were valid houses, apartments, post office boxes that existed or had existed within the past 2 centuries. But the intended recipients were not living there. They had drowned, been lost overboard, gone down with ships, or simply vanished somewhere between shore and horizon. The earliest death dated to 1789. The most recent was 1965. A fisherman lost off Georges Bank in 1942, a naval officer whose destroyer sank in the North Atlantic in 1943. A lighthouse keeper swept from the rocks at Boone Island in 1891. A passenger on a coastal steamer that foundered in 1857. A whaler who never returned from the Pacific in 1823. 14,000 names. 14,000 deaths by water. And 14,000 letters addressed to them, postmarked November 1967, as if someone expected them to receive their mail. The return addresses presented the second anomaly. Every letter bore a return address in the upper left corner, as convention required. The street names and numbers were specific. The cities and states were real. But when investigators attempted to verify these addresses, they found nothing. 15 Harborview Lane in Gloucester did not exist. 22 Anchorage Road in Portland had never been built. 8 Tidewater Court in Newport was an empty lot that had been empty since before the Civil War. The return addresses were precise, plausible, and entirely fictional. Postal investigators were brought in from Boston. The envelopes were examined for fingerprints, trace evidence, and manufacturing origin. The paper was standard commercial stock, available at any stationery store. The stamps were genuine, though none showed signs of having been canceled by postal machinery. The postmarks appeared to have been applied by hand, using ink that matched no known postal facility. After 2 weeks of analysis, the decision was made to open a sample of the letters. The first 10 were selected at random from different mail sacks. Each was photographed, documented, and carefully opened in the presence of witnesses. Every letter contained a single sheet of paper. On each sheet, handwritten in the center of the page, were 7 words. I am sorry I did not return. The handwriting varied from letter to letter. The investigators assumed at first that different people had written the messages. But when samples were compared against known documents, ship logs, personal correspondence, official records, a pattern emerged. Each letter was written in the handwriting of the person to whom it was addressed. A letter addressed to Thomas Kendrick, a fisherman lost in the Portland gale of 1898, was written in Thomas Kendrick's hand, matched against a marriage certificate he had signed in 1884. A letter to Elizabeth Parrish, a passenger lost when the steamer Lexington burned in Long Island Sound in 1840, was written in her hand, matched against a letter she had sent to her sister 3 days before the disaster. Every letter examined, and eventually all 14,000 were opened, contained the same 7 words in the handwriting of the deceased recipient. The Margaret Louise herself offered few additional clues. Her engine was inoperable, her fuel tanks empty, her navigation equipment destroyed by corrosion. She had no anchor in the conventional sense. The chain that trailed behind her was attached to nothing. Her wheelhouse contained no log, no charts, no personal effects. The only item found aboard other than the letters was a brass ship's clock mounted on the bulkhead. The clock was running. It showed a time of 3:47 and appeared to be keeping accurate time when recovered. But the clock's face bore no manufacturer's mark, and its mechanism, when examined by a horologist from the Smithsonian, was described as consistent with no known clock-making tradition. The expert noted that certain components appeared to be hand-filed from materials that predated industrial manufacturing, while others seemed to incorporate alloys that were not commercially available until the 1950s. "This clock should not exist," he wrote in his assessment. "It appears to have been built by someone familiar with 3 centuries of horological development, using that knowledge simultaneously." The clock was placed in storage with the letters. It continued to run for another 6 years without winding, then stopped on November 19, 1973, exactly 6 years after the Margaret Louise ran aground. Families of some of the deceased were contacted. Most had never heard of the Margaret Louise. None recognized the return addresses. A few asked to receive the letters addressed to their relatives, but the Coast Guard, unsure of the legal status of the mail, declined to release them. One family pursued the matter further. Clara Dennison of Marblehead, Massachusetts, was the granddaughter of a fisherman named Walter Dennison, who had been lost at sea in 1927 when his schooner, Alice May, sank in a sudden squall off Cape Ann. She hired an attorney and petitioned for the release of the letter addressed to her grandfather. After 14 months of legal proceedings, she was allowed to view the letter under supervision. The handwriting was compared to samples her family had preserved, a journal, several postcards, a note written to his wife on their wedding anniversary. The match was conclusive. The letter to Walter Dennison had been written by Walter Dennison. Clara Dennison was 81 years old at the time. She read the 7 words several times, then looked up at the Coast Guard officer present. "He never said goodbye," she said. "He left that morning and never said goodbye. My grandmother waited 50 years for some word, some explanation." She touched the paper gently. "Is this what happens? They write to themselves? They apologize to themselves?" No one could answer her. The letters remain in federal storage, classified as undeliverable mail of unknown origin. The Margaret Louise was towed off the rocks in December of 1967 and taken to a salvage yard in Portland, where she was scrapped the following spring. No further investigation was conducted. The case file was closed in 1970 with a summary that read, in part, "The source of the correspondence cannot be determined. The method by which the vessel arrived at Odiorn Point cannot be established. The authenticity of the handwriting matches has been verified but cannot be explained. Recommend no further action." A few letters have surfaced over the years in private collections, purchased at estate sales, or discovered among the effects of retired investigators. Each contains the same 7 words. Each is written in the hand of someone who died at sea. Each is addressed to a place that no longer exists, sent from a place that never did. The sea took 14,000 people over 2 centuries. Fishermen and sailors, passengers and pilots, men and women and children who went out on the water and did not come back. And somehow, in November of 1967, they all sent letters home. The same message, the same apology. The same 7 words that every person who has ever watched a ship disappear over the horizon has waited to hear. "I am sorry I did not return. The tide at Odiorn Point still rises and falls. The rocks still wait. And somewhere in a federal warehouse, 14,000 letters sit in canvas sacks, stamped and sealed and addressed to people who have been dead for decades or centuries. Letters from nowhere, written by no one, carrying the only words that ever mattered. Words that arrived too late to be read by anyone who needed to hear them. There are ships the Navy remembers, and there are ships the Navy chooses to forget. Portsmouth Harbor has served the United States Navy since 1778, when the first American warship built for the Continental Navy slid down the ways at what would become the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. The deep, protected waters of the Piscataqua River have sheltered frigates, battleships, and submarines across 2.5 centuries of American naval history. The harbor knows the silhouette of a warship the way a farmer knows the shape of his fields. In October of 1958, the harbor saw something it should not have seen. The first report came on the evening of October 7th. A longshoreman named Francis Corrigan was finishing a late shift at the commercial docks when he noticed a vessel anchored in the outer harbor, approximately a quarter mile from the Route 1 bridge. She was a destroyer, he was certain of that. Her profile was unmistakable: the low, sleek hull, the forward gun turrets, the twin stacks amidships. Her running lights were burning red and green and white, and her anchor light glowed at the bow. Corrigan had served in the Navy during the war. He knew destroyers. He estimated this one at 300 feet, a Gleaves class or possibly a Fletcher class, the workhorses of the Pacific and Atlantic fleets. He could see her hull number painted on the bow, 527. He watched for several minutes. No small boats moved between the ship and shore. No signals flashed from her bridge. She simply sat at anchor, lights burning, as if waiting for something. Corrigan mentioned the ship to his supervisor the next morning. The supervisor, a retired chief petty officer named Bernard Colodziej, was skeptical. No destroyer had been scheduled to visit Portsmouth. The shipyard dealt exclusively with submarines now. Surface combatants hadn't called at the port in years. But that evening, October 8th, Colodziej saw her too. Over the following 2 nights, at least 14 people reported seeing the destroyer at anchor in Portsmouth Harbor. Their accounts were consistent in every significant detail: a World War II-era destroyer, approximately 300 feet in length, bearing hull number 527. She appeared after sunset and remained visible until approximately 2 or 3 in the morning, when witnesses reported she had simply vanished. Not departed, but vanished, as if someone had switched off a light. The witnesses included dock workers, fishermen, a Portsmouth police officer on routine patrol, 2 Navy enlisted men stationed at the shipyard, and a retired Coast Guard captain named Howard Stanhope, who observed the vessel through binoculars from his home on Newcastle Island. Stanhope's account was the most detailed. He noted that the destroyer appeared to be in excellent condition. No visible rust, no structural damage, her paint fresh, and her lines taut. He observed figures moving on deck, though he could not make out features or uniforms. At one point, he saw what appeared to be a signal lamp flashing from the bridge, though the pattern corresponded to no code he recognized. She was real, Stanhope wrote in a letter to the Portsmouth Herald, which declined to publish it. I've been on the water for 40 years. I know the difference between a ship and a shadow. That was a United States Navy destroyer, and she was at anchor in this harbor for 3 nights running. On October 10th, Stanhope contacted the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard directly and requested information about the vessel. He was transferred 3 times before reaching an officer who would speak with him. The officer told him no destroyer had visited Portsmouth Harbor in October of 1958. No destroyer bearing hull number 527 was assigned to the Atlantic Fleet. No ship of any kind matching the description Stanhope provided was currently in service. Stanhope asked about inactive ships, reserve vessels, ships being towed for scrapping. The officer repeated, no such ship existed. The sighting stopped after October 9th. The destroyer did not appear on the 10th or any night thereafter. The witnesses compared notes, argued with skeptics, and eventually fell silent. The story became a local curiosity, discussed occasionally in waterfront bars, then largely forgotten. But Francis Corrigan did not forget. He had written down the hull number, 527. He had served on a destroyer himself during the war, the USS Kendrick, DD-612, and he knew that hull numbers were unique identifiers. Every ship had one. Every number was recorded. In 1973, after his retirement, Corrigan began researching the number. The Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington maintained records of every commissioned vessel in the history of the United States Navy. He wrote to them requesting information about DD-527. The response arrived 6 weeks later. It was brief. No vessel bearing hull number DD-527 has been commissioned by the United States Navy. Corrigan was unsatisfied. He expanded his research, corresponding with naval historians, visiting archives, collecting commissioning records for every destroyer class built during World War II. The Gleaves class used hull numbers in the 400s. The Fletcher class began at DD-445 and ran through DD-691. DD-527 should have existed. The number fell squarely within the Fletcher-class sequence. Corrigan obtained a list of all Fletcher-class destroyers ever built. He found DD-525. He found DD-526. He found DD-528 and DD-529. DD-527 was not on the list. The number had been skipped. Corrigan died in 1981, his research incomplete. His notes were preserved by his daughter, who donated them to the Portsmouth Athenaeum in 1994. They sat in the collection unexamined until 2006, when a graduate student named Michael Andreou discovered them while researching a thesis on naval shipbuilding in New Hampshire. Andreou was intrigued by the gap in hull numbers. He submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the Navy for any records pertaining to DD-527. The response, when it came, was unexpected. The Navy acknowledged that a vessel designated DD-527 had been laid down at the Federal Shipbuilding and Drydock Company in Kearney, New Jersey, in May of 1943. Construction had been completed in February of 1944. The ship had been provisionally named USS Holbrook, but she had never been commissioned. According to the records provided, the Holbrook had been canceled prior to completion, and her hull had been disposed of through standard salvage procedures. Andreou found this explanation puzzling. The document stated the ship had been completed. How could a completed ship be canceled? He requested additional records. After several months of bureaucratic delay, he received a partial crew manifest for the Holbrook, a list of 273 names, all marked with the annotation "Transferred," and a date, November 15, 1944. Transferred where? The document did not say. Andreou began tracing the names. He found 17 inaccessible records, census data, draft registrations, Social Security files. All 17 had died on November 15, 1944. The causes of death varied: heart failure, accident, illness. None mentioned military service. None mentioned a ship. A naval historian at the National Archives, speaking off the record, suggested to Andreou that the Holbrook may have been lost in an incident the Navy chose not to disclose. Ships were occasionally removed from the record during wartime, particularly when their loss involved classified operations, friendly fire, or catastrophic failures that might undermine morale. If a ship sank under circumstances the Navy didn't want to explain, the historian said, they might simply erase her, cancel the hull number retroactively, transfer the crew to non-existent assignments. It happened more than people realize. But why would the Holbrook have appeared in Portsmouth Harbor in 1958, 14 years after her supposed loss? The historian had no answer. Andreu attempted to contact descendants of the crew members he had identified. Most families had no information. A few had vague stories of relatives who had served in the Navy and died during the war, but no specifics. 2 families possessed photographs of their relatives in naval uniform standing on the deck of a destroyer. One photograph, belonging to a family in Ohio, showed a young sailor named Edward Pollack standing near a gun mount. Behind him, partially visible on a bulkhead, was a painted number, 527. The photograph was examined by an imaging specialist who confirmed that the number had not been altered or added later. The image was consistent with wartime photography of the 1940s. Edward Pollack had served on DD 527. He had died on November 15, 1944. His death certificate listed the cause as accidental drowning at a location in New Jersey. The Holbrook had been built in New Jersey. If she had sunk or suffered some catastrophic incident near her construction site, the crew might have died in local waters. The bodies might have been recovered. The deaths might have been recorded as civilian accidents to avoid disclosure. But none of this explained what Frances Corrigan and 14 other witnesses saw in Portsmouth Harbor in October of 1958. A ship that never existed, a crew that was never killed, a hull number that was skipped in every official record, 3 nights at anchor, lights burning, figures moving on deck, and then gone, as if she had never been there at all. The USS Holbrook, DD 527, does not appear in any published history of the United States Navy. Her name is not inscribed on any memorial. Her crew are not honored among the war dead. The Navy maintains that no such ship was ever commissioned. The records state she was canceled, scrapped, disposed of through standard procedures. The 273 men on her crew manifest were transferred to other assignments and died, coincidentally, on the same day, of causes unrelated to naval service. The gap in hull numbers remains. DD-5-2-5, DD-5-2-6, DD-5-2-8. The sequence skips as if avoiding something, as if the number itself were unlucky. Howard Stanhope's letter to the Portsmouth Herald was never published. His binoculars, according to his family, were found on his windowsill after his death in 1971, still pointed toward the spot in the harbor where he had seen the ship. Frances Corrigan's notes fill 3 folders at the Portsmouth Athenaeum. The final entry, dated 2 weeks before his death, reads, "I know what I saw, I know what I served on. That was a Navy ship. She had a crew, she had a number. And somebody decided she didn't exist. But she came back. She came back to show us she was real." The harbor is quiet now. The submarines come and go. The surface Navy has not visited Portsmouth in decades. But on certain October nights, when the fog rolls in and the lights along the waterfront blur and soften, a few old-timers still look out toward the outer anchorage. They are watching for a ship that never existed, a ship the Navy denied, a ship that for 3 nights in 1958 refused to be forgotten. The sea takes, and sometimes without explanation, the sea returns. Genesee Beach is a modest stretch of sand along New Hampshire's 18-mile coastline, tucked between the rocky headlands of Rye to the north and the more developed shores of Hampton to the south. It is not a destination beach, no boardwalk, no arcades, no hotels crowding the waterfront. It is a local beach frequented by families from the surrounding towns who prefer its relative quiet. The water is cold even in summer. The waves are gentle. The sand is coarse with broken shells. On most September mornings, the beach is nearly empty. The summer crowds have gone. The water has begun its slow cooling toward winter. Dog walkers and joggers pass through at dawn, but by the time the sun clears the horizon, the shore belongs to the gulls. September 3, 1971 was different. Meredith Cahill was the first to find them. She was a retired schoolteacher who walked Genesee Beach every morning with her Irish setter, a routine she had maintained for 11 years. She arrived at approximately 6:15, parked in the small lot at the beach's southern end, and released the dog onto the sand. The dog ran north, then stopped. He began to bark, not the excited bark of a dog chasing birds, but something lower, more urgent. Meredith followed. The first body lay at the tide line, face up, arms at his sides. He was a man in his 50s, wearing a wool sweater and canvas trousers, the kind of clothing fishermen had worn a generation earlier. His skin was pale but intact. His eyes were closed. He looked, Meredith would later tell investigators, like he was sleeping. 20 yards farther north, she found the second body, then the third. Then 4 more, clustered together as if they had arrived on the same wave. By the time she reached the end of the stretch, approximately 100 yards from where she had started, Meredith Cahill had counted 11 men lying on the sand. She did not touch any of them. She walked back to her car, drove to the nearest payphone, and called the police. Rye Police Chief Warren Eastman arrived at 7:03 with 2 officers and an ambulance. By 8 o'clock, the New Hampshire State Police had taken jurisdiction. By noon, the beach had been cordoned off, and a temporary morgue had been established at the Rye Fire Station. The 11 bodies were photographed, examined, and documented. All were male. Ages ranged from approximately 25 to 60. Clothing varied in style and condition, but was consistent with maritime work: wool sweaters, oilskin jackets, rubber boots, canvas trousers. Several wore items that had not been manufactured in decades. None of the bodies showed signs of decomposition. This was, according to the medical examiner, impossible. Bodies that had been in the water for any significant period, days, weeks, months, showed predictable changes: bloating, discoloration, tissue breakdown. The ocean accelerated these processes. Salt water, marine life, temperature fluctuations all contributed to rapid decay. These 11 men appeared to have died within hours. Dr. Franklin Morris, the Rockingham County medical examiner, conducted preliminary examinations that afternoon. His notes, preserved in the state archives, reveal his confusion. Subject appears recently deceased. No evidence of prolonged submersion. Skin intact. No predation. No saponification. Lividity consistent with supine position. Cause of death undetermined, pending autopsy. He wrote the same assessment with minor variations for all 11. Identification proved difficult. None of the men carried wallets, identification cards, or personal documents. Their clothing bore no labels that could be traced to specific manufacturers or retailers. Several wore wedding rings, but the inscriptions were worn smooth. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A state police detective named Arthur Pelletier noticed that one of the men, a heavy-set individual in his 40s, had a distinctive scar on his left hand, running from the base of the thumb to the wrist. Pelletier had grown up in a fishing family in Gloucester, Massachusetts. He recognized the scar as a common injury among men who worked with gill nets. On a hunch, he contacted the Gloucester Police Department and requested access to their missing persons files. He described the scar and the man's approximate age and build. Within 48 hours, he had a name: Robert Andrade, a gill netter who had been lost at sea in October of 1954 when his boat, the Santa Maria, went down in a storm off Cape Ann. His body had never been recovered. The photograph in the missing persons file matched the body on the slab. Robert Andrade had been dead for 17 years. His body showed no signs of having been in the water for more than a few hours. Over the following week, investigators identified 8 more of the 11 men. Each identification followed the same pattern: a missing fisherman lost at sea, body never recovered. The dates of their disappearances spanned 4 decades. Henry Broussard, lost off the coast of Louisiana in 1931. William Crichton, lost in the Bay of Fundy in 1947. Joseph Medeiros, lost near the Grand Banks in 1963. Thomas Nilsson, lost in the Bering Sea in 1958. James Thibodeau, lost off Cape Hatteras in 1942. Michael Stavros, lost near Block Island in 1939. Patrick Sweeney, lost in the Gulf of Maine in 1967. Daniel Robichaud, lost off Prince Edward Island in 1955. The remaining 2 bodies were never identified. Their fingerprints matched no records. Their faces matched no photographs in any missing persons database. They remained John Does, buried eventually in unmarked graves at the state's expense. The identified men came from different ports, different states, different decades. They had no known connection to one another. They had not sailed together, fished together, or lived in the same communities. The only thing they shared was the manner of their disappearance. They had all been lost at sea. And on September 3, 1971, they had all washed ashore on the same 100-yard stretch of Genesee Beach. Autopsies were scheduled for September 4th. Dr. Morse arrived at the Rye Fire Station at 8 in the morning to begin the procedures. The bodies were gone. The storage area had been locked overnight. The door showed no signs of forced entry. The single window was intact and latched from the inside. A Rye police officer had been stationed at the building entrance from midnight until 6 in the morning. He reported seeing and hearing nothing unusual. 11 bodies had vanished from a locked room without a trace. A search was conducted. The beach was re-examined. The surrounding area was canvassed. No evidence was found. No witnesses came forward. The bodies were never recovered. Later that same day, the families of the 9 identified men began receiving letters. The letters arrived through standard mail, postmarked September 3, 1971, the same day the bodies had been found. Each was addressed to the next of kin of one of the deceased fishermen. Each contained a single sheet of paper with 4 words typed in the center. The debt is paid. There was no signature, no return address, no explanation. The envelopes were examined for fingerprints and trace evidence. Nothing was found. The paper was standard bond, available at any office supply store. The typeface was consistent with an IBM Selectric, one of the most common typewriters of the era. The postmarks indicated the letters had been mailed from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Investigators attempted to determine who had sent them. Post office employees were interviewed. Surveillance of mailboxes was reviewed. No leads emerged. The families were left with questions that would never be answered. Margaret Andrade, widow of Robert Andrade, was 73 years old when she received her letter. She had waited 17 years for news of her husband. She had never remarried. She had kept his photograph on her mantel and his clothes in the closet, unable to fully accept that he was gone. She told a reporter from the Gloucester Daily Times that she had felt something on the morning of September 3rd. A lightness, she called it, a sense of release. She had woken before dawn and known, without understanding how she knew, that something had changed. "I don't know what debt they're talking about," she said. "I don't know who sent the letter, but I believe Bobby came back. I believe they all came back. And then they went to wherever they were supposed to go." She died 3 months later, the letter still in her bedside drawer. The case was never solved. The file remains open in the archives of the New Hampshire State Police, classified as unexplained. The medical examiner's preliminary notes are the only physical documentation of the 11 bodies. No photographs survived. The film from that day was lost during a departmental move in 1978. The identification records were destroyed in a fire at the Rockingham County Courthouse in 1983. Only the letters remain. 9 families received them. 9 families kept them. Several have been donated to local historical societies or maritime museums over the years. They are identical in every respect. Same paper, same typeface, same 4 words. The debt is paid. Folklorists have speculated about the meaning. Some suggest it refers to the old maritime belief that the sea demands a price for safe passage, a life for a life, a soul for a soul. Others propose a more literal interpretation, that the fishermen had owed something, done something, failed to honor some obligation, and that their return was a settling of accounts. But no one knows what debt was owed or to whom, or why it was collected on a quiet beach in New Hampshire on a September morning in 1971. The sea does not explain itself. Genis Beach looks the same today as it did 50 years ago. The sand is coarse, the waves are gentle, the summer crowds have gone, and the water grows colder with each passing week. Dog walkers still pass through at dawn. Joggers still trace the tide line as the sun rises. And somewhere beneath the surface, in waters that connect every port and every coast, the sea keeps its records. It knows who is owed. It knows who owes. And sometimes, without warning, it balances the ledger. Maps are supposed to show what is there, but some maps show what should not be. The Isles of Shoals are a cluster of 9 small islands straddling the border between New Hampshire and Maine, approximately 6 miles off the coast of Portsmouth. They are rocky, windswept, and sparse, home to a few seasonal residents, a marine research station, and the ghosts of a fishing community that thrived here for 2 centuries before abandoning the islands to the gulls and the sea. The waters around the shoals are treacherous, studded with submerged ledges and prone to sudden fog. Dozens of ships have come to grief here since the 1600s. The Adelaide was one of them. She was a clipper ship, 218 feet in length, built in Boston in 1851 for the China trade. Her owner was a merchant named Cornelius Blackwood, who had made his fortune importing tea and silk through ports that most New England traders avoided. The Adelaide was his flagship, known for her speed and for the peculiar routes her captain chose, routes that took her far from established shipping lanes and returned her to port weeks earlier than her competitors expected. On November 9, 1857, the Adelaide departed Portsmouth bound for Liverpool with a cargo of New Hampshire timber. She never arrived. Wreckage washed ashore on Star Island 3 days later. The ship was presumed lost with all hands, 42 men, including her captain, a Portuguese navigator named Marcos Ferreira. The wreck was located in 1967 by a lobsterman whose trap line snagged on something deep. She lay in 87 feet of water on a sandy bottom northeast of Lunging Island, her hull broken amidships, her masts long since collapsed. Sport divers visited her occasionally over the following years, retrieving coins, bottles, and fragments of porcelain. The Adelaide became a footnote in the long history of shipwrecks around the shoals. Then, in August of 1983, a team of divers from the University of New Hampshire discovered the chart room. The team was conducting an archaeological survey of the wreck as part of a graduate program in maritime history. Their objective was to document the Adelaide's construction and cargo, adding to the historical record of mid-19th century clipper ships. The project was routine, adequately funded, and expected to yield predictable results. On the 3rd day of diving, a student named Christine Alderman noticed a section of the hull that had not been previously explored. A collapsed bulkhead had created a sealed pocket in the forward section of the ship, an airspace that had remained intact for over a century. Alderman reported the discovery to the project director, Dr. Samuel Fleischer, who organized a careful excavation. It took 2 days to clear enough debris to access the compartment. When Alderman finally squeezed through the gap, she found herself in what had once been the captain's chart room. The space was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, and remarkably preserved. Wooden cabinets lined the walls, their doors swollen shut but intact. A navigation table stood in the center, bolted to the deck. Instruments hung from hooks, a sextant, a compass, a set of dividers. And spread across the table, held in place by the weight of the water, were charts. Alderman photographed everything before touching anything. When she finally lifted the first chart from the table, she realized something was wrong. The chart depicted a coastline she did not recognize. The charts were transported to the surface in sealed containers and delivered to the university's cartography department for analysis. Dr. Helen Morrow, a specialist in historical navigation, led the examination. Her preliminary report, submitted 3 weeks later, raised more questions than it answered. The Adelaide had carried 17 charts. 14 depicted known waters, the Atlantic coast of North America, the approaches to Liverpool, the Channel Islands, the Azores. These were consistent with the ship's documented voyages and showed nothing unusual. The remaining 3 charts were different. The first depicted an island chain in the central Atlantic, approximately 800 miles east of Bermuda. The islands were rendered in detail: harbors, anchorages, elevation contours, depth soundings. Annotations in Portuguese identified features: Baía do Silêncio, Ponta das Sombras, Rio Interior, as if the cartographer had visited personally and named what he found. No such islands exist. The location indicated on the chart corresponds to open ocean over 3 miles deep. The second chart showed a continental coastline extending northeast from a point roughly where the mid-Atlantic ridge lies today. The coast ran for over 1,000 miles, curving westward toward what appeared to be a large bay or inland sea. Cities were marked, small symbols indicating settlements, connected by dotted lines that might have represented roads or shipping routes. The names were in a language Dr. Morrow could not identify. They bore no resemblance to Portuguese, Spanish, English, or any other European tongue. Linguistic specialists consulted on the project were unable to classify them. The third chart was a detailed harbor survey of a port that, according to its indicated position, should have been located approximately 200 miles south of Iceland. The chart showed wharves, warehouses, a lighthouse, and a system of breakwaters protecting the anchorage from northern swells. Depth soundings indicated a well-dredged channel. Notations suggested the port was active and frequently visited. The coordinates placed it in the middle of the North Atlantic, where the ocean floor lies nearly 2 miles beneath the surface. The ship's log was recovered from a locked cabinet in the chart room. Unlike most documents exposed to seawater for over a century, the log was partially legible, protected, it seemed, by an oilcloth wrapping that had remained sealed until the divers opened it. Dr. Fleischer supervised the careful separation of the pages. The ink had faded and run in places, but patient work under controlled conditions revealed enough text to reconstruct portions of the Adelaide's final voyage. The log began conventionally. The ship departed Portsmouth on November 9, 1857, with fair weather and a following wind. Entries for November 10th and 11th recorded routine sailing, course corrections, crew assignments, observations on sea state and weather. On November 12th, the entries changed. Sighted land to the east at dawn. Captain Ferreira consulted charts and confirmed position. We are where we should not be. The coast extends north and south beyond sight. No such land is marked on any chart I have seen save those the captain keeps locked in his cabin. The entry was unsigned, but appeared to be written by the ship's first mate, a man named Jonathan Howe. Subsequent entries grew increasingly fragmented. November 13th. Anchored in harbor. The captain has gone ashore with 6 men. The water is calm. The sky is wrong. November 14th. Captain returned at sunset. He will not speak of what he saw. We depart at midnight. November 15th. The land is gone. The sea is empty. The captain has locked himself in the chart room and will not come out. The final entry was dated November 16, 1857. "We have reached the coordinates the captain sought. There is nothing here but water. He says the door is beneath us. He says we must pay what is owed. God help us all." Below this, in a different hand, possibly Captain Ferreira's, were a set of coordinates: 41 degrees, 17 minutes north, 33 degrees, 42 minutes west. The coordinates correspond to the Milwaukee Deep, the deepest point in the Atlantic Ocean, over 28,000 feet below the surface. Dr. Fleischer's team attempted to find historical records that might explain the charts. They searched archives in Boston, Portsmouth, Lisbon, and London. They consulted specialists in 19th century navigation, cartographic history, and Atlantic exploration. They found nothing. Cornelius Blackwood, the ship's owner, had died in 1862. His papers were destroyed in a fire that consumed his Boston warehouse in 1871. Captain Marcos Ferreira had no known family and left no personal records. The crew of the Adelaide were ordinary seamen, hired for the voyage, most of them illiterate. But one clue emerged from an unexpected source. A maritime insurance document from 1855, preserved in a Lloyd's of London archive, referenced a claim filed by Blackwood regarding an earlier voyage of the Adelaide. The claim was for a cargo lost during an unscheduled deviation from the established route. The insurer had denied the claim, noting that the Adelaide had arrived in port 6 weeks earlier than expected, having supposedly traveled a distance that should have taken 3 months. The document included a notation from the insurance investigator. Captain Ferreira refused to explain the discrepancy. He stated only that he had found a shorter way. No evidence of fraud was established, but the deviation remains unexplained. A shorter way, through waters where no land exists, past coastlines that appear on no other chart, to coordinates that mark the deepest hole in the Atlantic Ocean. The charts from the Adelaide are now held in the special collections of the University of New Hampshire Library. They are not on public display. Requests to examine them must be approved by a committee that has, according to library records, denied every application submitted since 1987. Dr. Helen Morrow published a single paper on the charts in 1985, focusing on their construction techniques and materials. She concluded that they were genuine 19th century artifacts, created using methods consistent with Portuguese cartographic traditions of the period. She did not address the question of what they depicted. She retired from the university in 1991 and declined all subsequent interview requests. In a letter to a former colleague, written shortly before her death in 2014, she offered only one observation about the charts. They are not fantasies. They are not mistakes. Whoever drew them believed they were accurate. They included depth soundings, tidal notations, compass corrections for magnetic variation. These are the charts of a navigator who had been to these places and intended to return. The question is not whether the places are real. The question is whether they are still there. The wreck of the Adelaide remains on the sandy bottom northeast of Lunging Island. Divers still visit occasionally. The chart room has collapsed since 1983, crushed by the slow deterioration of the surrounding hull. The log, the charts, and the coordinates survive. 41 degrees, 17 minutes north, 33 degrees, 42 minutes west, the deepest point in the Atlantic. The place Captain Ferreira called the door. No one has ever explained what he expected to find there. No one has ever gone to look. Every ship keeps records, but some records are never meant to be found. The Endurance was a coastal freighter of no particular distinction, a steel-hulled vessel of 1,800 tons built in Glasgow in 1912 and sold through a succession of owners before arriving in American waters sometime in the early 1920s. She carried general cargo along the Atlantic seaboard: lumber, machine parts, dry goods, occasionally livestock. Her ports of call were the working harbors of New England: Portland, Boston, New Bedford, Portsmouth, places where paperwork was processed quickly and ships were not examined too closely. Her captain was a man named Aldous Crane. He held a valid master's license issued by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in 1919. His certificate listed his birthplace as Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, though Canadian records contained no evidence of his birth or residence there. He was described by those who met him as quiet, professional, and entirely forgettable, a man who conducted his business efficiently and attracted no attention. For 18 years, Captain Crane and the Endurance moved cargo up and down the coast without incident. Then, on October 15, 1937, a customs inspector in Portsmouth noticed a discrepancy in the ship's declared tonnage. The Endurance was riding too low in the water for her listed cargo. Inspector Harold Tomlinson ordered a full inspection. His team spent 6 hours examining the ship's holds, storage compartments, and crew quarters. They found nothing unusual. The cargo matched the manifest, the crew papers were in order, and the vessel appeared to be exactly what she claimed to be. But Tomlinson was not satisfied. He had been a customs inspector for 23 years, and he had developed an instinct for ships that were hiding something. The Endurance felt wrong to him. The spaces did not add up. There was volume missing somewhere. He ordered the ship impounded, pending a more thorough examination. The following morning, Tomlinson returned with a naval architect named Frederick Barlow, who had experience identifying smuggling compartments on cargo vessels. Barlow spent 4 hours measuring the Endurance's interior dimensions and comparing them to her known specifications. He found the discrepancy in the forward hold. The bulkhead separating the forward hold from the bow section was positioned 8 feet further aft than the ship's original plans indicated. Behind it, accessible only through a concealed hatch disguised as part of the deck plating, was a compartment approximately 12 feet long, 10 feet wide, and 7 feet high. The compartment was empty, but it had not always been. The walls were fitted with iron rings, the kind used for securing cargo or restraining passengers. The floor was stained with substances that Barlow declined to identify in his written report. A ventilation system, crude but functional, had been installed to provide air circulation, and on a small shelf near the hatch, wrapped in oilcloth, was a leather-bound ledger. Tomlinson opened it. He read the first page. Then he closed it and immediately contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The ledger was a manifest, a passenger manifest, for a ship that officially carried no passengers. It listed 214 names. Each entry followed the same format: a name, an age, a physical description, a date of embarkation, a port of origin, and a destination. The destinations were not places Tomlinson recognized. Names like Acheron Station, the Quiet Berth, and Terminal Shoal, but each entry concluded with the same notation written in a precise mechanical hand: delivered. The dates of embarkation spanned 19 years, from August of 1918 to September of 1937. The ports of origin were coastal towns throughout New England: Gloucester, Rockport, Provincetown, Kennebunkport, Belfast, Eastport. The ages ranged from 17 to 64. The physical descriptions were detailed enough to identify individuals, scars, birthmarks, missing fingers, distinctive features. The FBI cross-referenced the names against missing persons reports from the listed ports of origin. Every name matched. 214 people who had vanished from New England coastal communities over 19 years. Fishermen who never returned from the docks. Drifters who passed through town and were never seen again. Widows who lived alone. Young men without families. People who would not be missed or would not be missed for long. All of them listed in a leather-bound ledger, all of them marked as delivered. Captain Aldous Crane was not aboard the Endurance when the hidden compartment was discovered. He had departed the ship the previous evening, ostensibly to file paperwork at the harbormaster's office. He never arrived. No one reported seeing him leave the waterfront. No one reported seeing him at all. A warrant was issued for his arrest. His photograph, taken from his maritime license, was distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout New England. Tips came in from a dozen states over the following months. None led to Crane. The crew of the Endurance, 7 men, all with valid seaman's papers, were detained and interrogated. Their stories were consistent. They knew nothing of the hidden compartment, nothing of the ledger, nothing of any passengers. They were hired hands, paid to load cargo and maintain the ship. They followed Captain Crane's orders and asked no questions. Investigators found this difficult to believe. The hidden compartment was large enough to hold 20 or 30 people at a time. Someone had to have seen something over 19 years of operation. Someone had to have heard something, voices, footsteps, the sounds of people being moved in the night. But the crew maintained their ignorance, and without evidence of direct involvement, they could not be charged. All 7 were released after 2 weeks of questioning. Within a year, all 7 had died, 3 in accidents, 2 of sudden illness, 1 by his own hand, 1 simply vanished. The investigating agent noted the coincidence in his final report, but drew no conclusions. The destinations listed in the manifest presented their own mystery. Acheron Station, the Quiet Berth, Terminal Shoal, Stillwater Landing, the 7th Anchorage. These names appeared repeatedly throughout the ledger, rotating in no discernible pattern. FBI agents searched maritime records, coastal surveys, and navigation charts for any reference to these locations. They found nothing. A retired naval cartographer named Benjamin Cross, consulted as an expert witness, offered a disturbing observation. Several of the names he noted appeared in obscure maritime folklore, stories told by sailors who had traveled too far or seen too much. Acheron Station appears in a Portuguese sailing journal from the 16th century, Cross wrote in his assessment. The author describes it as a place where ships go to discharge cargo that cannot be delivered anywhere else. The Quiet Berth is referenced in Scottish fishing traditions as a final mooring for vessels that have completed their service. These are not real places. They are not meant to be real places. They are metaphors for death. If Cross was correct, the Endurance had been delivering people to places that existed only in legend, or in something worse than legend. The FBI dismissed Cross's interpretation as speculation. The official report concluded that the destinations were likely code names for actual locations, possibly in international waters, where illegal activities could be conducted without oversight. The nature of those activities was not determined. But 3 days after the discovery of the manifest, the Endurance caught fire. The blaze was reported at approximately 2 o'clock in the morning on October 19, 1937. A night watchman at the Portsmouth waterfront saw flames erupting from the ship's forward section, the section containing the hidden compartment. Fire crews responded within minutes. What they encountered defied explanation. The flames were visible. They consumed the ship's wooden superstructure, melted her brass fittings, and blackened her steel hull. But the fire produced no heat. Firefighters approaching the vessel reported feeling nothing, no warmth, no radiant energy, no change in air temperature. One fireman, Patrick Donnelly, walked within 10 feet of the burning hull and later described the experience as standing next to a picture of a fire. Water had no effect. Chemical suppressants had no effect. The flames burned at their own pace, methodical and unhurried, until the Endurance was reduced to a charred skeleton resting on the harbor bottom. The fire burned for 6 hours. When it finally died, the ship's remains were cold to the touch. The water surrounding the wreck was the same temperature as the rest of the harbor. No heat had been generated, no smoke had been produced. Nothing remained but ash and twisted metal. The manifests, both the official cargo manifest and the leather-bound passenger ledger, had been stored in the customs office for safekeeping. They were not aboard the ship when it burned. The ledger remains in federal custody. It has never been released to the public. Families of the missing were contacted in the months following the discovery. Most had long since accepted their losses, moved away, remarried, rebuilt their lives around absences that would never be explained. A few asked questions. Martha Bergstrom of Gloucester, Massachusetts, was the sister of a fisherman named Eric Bergstrom who had disappeared in September of 1924. She traveled to Portsmouth to meet with federal investigators and requested to see the ledger entry bearing her brother's name. It was his description exactly, she told a reporter from the Boston Globe, the scar on his chin from the fishhook accident, the missing tip of his left ring finger, details no one outside the family would have known. She asked what delivered meant. The investigators could not tell her. I asked where he was delivered to, she said. They showed me the destination, the 7th Anchorage. I asked what that was. They said they didn't know. I asked if my brother was dead. They said they didn't know that either. Martha Bergstrom died in 1953. She never learned what happened to her brother. The case of the Endurance was officially closed in 1941, classified as unsolved. The ledger was transferred to a federal archive in Washington, where it remains sealed under a national security exemption that has never been explained. Captain Aldous Crane was never found. His maritime license was revoked in absentia. His name appears in no records after October of 1937, no tax filings, no property transactions, no death certificate. He simply ceased to exist as thoroughly as the 214 people listed in his second manifest. The wreck of the Endurance was removed from Portsmouth Harbor in 1939 and sold for scrap. Workers who dismantled her reported finding nothing unusual, just ash, rust, and the ordinary bones of an ordinary ship. But fishermen who worked the harbor in the years that followed sometimes spoke of lights in the water where the Endurance had burned. Faint, cold lights that moved beneath the surface on autumn nights, drifting slowly toward the open sea. They did not follow the lights. Some debts are best left unpaid, some cargo is best left undelivered, and some manifests, the ones that list names instead of goods, destinations instead of ports, are never meant to be found. The Endurance kept 2 sets of books. The first recorded what she carried, the second recorded who. A lighthouse exists to bring ships home, but some lights have other purposes. White Island is the southernmost of the Isles of Shoals, a barren granite outcrop approximately 6 miles off the coast of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. It is small, barely 3 acres of rock, scrub grass, and weathered stone, and it has been home to a lighthouse since 1820. The original tower was replaced in 1859 with the structure that stands today, a conical brick lighthouse, 63 feet tall, painted white with a black lantern room. For over a century, its light warned mariners away from the treacherous shoals that surround the islands, guiding them safely through waters that had claimed ships since the 1600s. The light was automated in 1967, its keepers withdrawn, its mechanism converted to an electric beacon that required no human tending. For 20 more years, the lamp continued its rotation, a flash every 15 seconds, visible for 16 miles in clear conditions. In 1987, the Coast Guard determined that the White Island light was redundant. Modern navigation systems, GPS technology, and updated channel markers had rendered the old lighthouse obsolete. The lamp was removed, the electrical systems disconnected, the tower sealed against trespassers. The lighthouse became a historical monument, maintained by preservation societies, but no longer operational. The light went out in November of 1987. By February of 1988, fishermen were reporting that it had come back. The first report came from a lobsterman named Gerard Thibault, who had worked the waters around the shoals for over 30 years. He was returning to Portsmouth Harbor on the night of February 17th, running late after a long day of hauling traps. The weather was clear, the sea calm. Visibility was excellent. As Thibault passed south of White Island, he saw a light burning in the tower. He knew the lighthouse had been decommissioned. He had read about it in the Portsmouth Herald, had discussed it with other fishermen who lamented the loss of a landmark they had used for navigation since childhood. The light should not have been there. But there it was, a steady, pale glow emanating from the lantern room, not the rotating flash of the old beacon, but something fixed and constant, like a candle flame magnified to enormous size. Thibault radioed the Coast Guard to report the anomaly. The duty officer informed him that no light was operational at White Island and suggested he might be seeing a reflection or an optical illusion caused by atmospheric conditions. Thibault did not argue. He continued to Portsmouth, docked his boat, and went home. He did not mention the light again until 3 weeks later, when another fisherman reported the same thing. Over the following months, reports accumulated. Fishermen, recreational boaters, ferry captains, and Coast Guard personnel all described seeing a light at White Island, always at night, always in clear conditions, always fixed rather than flashing. The descriptions were consistent, a pale, steady glow, slightly bluish in tint, emanating from the lantern room of the decommissioned tower. The Coast Guard investigated. A team visited White Island in April of 1988 and confirmed that no light source existed in the tower. The electrical systems had been removed. The lantern room was empty. There was no mechanism by which a light could be produced. Yet the reports continued. In June of 1988, a Coast Guard patrol boat was dispatched to investigate a sighting in progress. A fishing vessel had radioed that the White Island light was visible and appeared unusually bright. The patrol boat proceeded to the island at full speed. The crew saw nothing. They circled White Island 3 times, approached to within 100 yards of the tower, and trained spotlights on the lantern room. The lighthouse was dark. The fishing vessel, still within visual range, insisted the light was burning clearly. They could see it at that very moment. The Coast Guard crew could not. The patrol boat's radar showed no anomalies. Their cameras captured only darkness where the light should have been. The fishing vessel's captain, a man named Roland Fournier, later submitted a written statement describing what he had seen. The light was there. It was as real as the light on your patrol boat. My crew saw it. I saw it. We watched your men circle the island, and the light was burning the whole time right above their heads. They looked straight at it and didn't see it. I don't know how to explain that. I don't think I want to. The first casualty occurred in September of 1989. A pleasure yacht named Sea Whisper, carrying 4 passengers from Boston to Portland, ran aground on the rocks northeast of White Island at approximately 11:30 at night. The vessel struck a submerged ledge at nearly full speed, tearing open her hull. She sank within minutes. 3 passengers were rescued by a nearby fishing boat. The 4th, a woman named Caroline Prescott, drowned. The yacht's captain, a man named Douglas Wentworth, survived with minor injuries. In his statement to the Coast Guard, he described what had happened. I saw the White Island light. I know it's not supposed to be there. I've been sailing these waters for 15 years. But I saw it clear as day. It was guiding me through what I thought was a safe channel. I followed it. The closer I got, the brighter it became. Then we hit the rocks. Wentworth was tested for alcohol and drugs. The results were negative. He was an experienced sailor with an unblemished record. He had no explanation for why he had followed a light toward rocks he knew were there. It wasn't leading me to safety, he said. I understand that now. It was leading me somewhere else. Over the next 3 decades, 10 more vessels would meet similar fates. In 1992, a fishing trawler named Northern Venture ran aground on Londoners Rock after her captain reported following the light at White Island through a fog bank. The crew was rescued. The vessel was a total loss. In 1997, a sailboat carrying a retired couple from Connecticut struck a submerged ledge east of the island. Both passengers survived, but the husband, a man named Franklin Pierce, suffered permanent spinal injuries. He told investigators he had seen the lighthouse burning like a beacon calling me in. In 2003, a lobster boat named Mary Catherine went down in calm seas within sight of White Island. Her captain was never found. A deckhand who survived clinging to debris for 6 hours reported that the captain had become fixated on a light in the tower, a light the deckhand could not see. In 2008, a Coast Guard auxiliary vessel, participating in a training exercise near the shoals, deviated from its assigned course and ran aground on a reef that every chart clearly marked. The officer at the helm, a 20-year veteran named Patricia Solano, was unable to explain her actions. She remembered seeing a light. She remembered following it. She did not remember the reef. In 2016, a charter fishing boat went down with 4 passengers after her captain reported navigational confusion caused by a light where there shouldn't be one. 3 passengers drowned. The captain, a man named William Boudreau, was pulled from the water in a state of shock. His only words, repeated for hours, were, "It wanted us. The light wanted us." Attempts to document the phenomenon have failed consistently. Photographers have spent nights on boats near White Island, cameras trained on the tower. Their images show only darkness. Video recordings capture nothing. Thermal imaging detects no heat signature in the lantern room. Radar shows no anomalies. Yet the sightings continue, dozens of them reported by credible witnesses, often by multiple observers simultaneously. The pattern is always the same: a pale, steady light, visible to some but not others, appearing in clear conditions, drawing vessels not toward safe passage, but toward hidden dangers. Marine investigators have noted a troubling correlation. Every vessel that has run aground or sunk while following the light was headed in the same general direction, toward a point approximately 4 miles southeast of White Island, where the seafloor drops suddenly from 60 feet to over 300. The area is known locally as the Hole, an underwater canyon carved by ancient glacial action, deeper and darker than any other feature in the surrounding waters. The light does not guide ships to harbor. It guides them to the hole. Local historians have searched for explanations rooted in the island's past. White Island was the site of a shipwreck in 1813, when a coastal schooner named Deliverance went down during a December storm. All 18 passengers drowned. Their bodies were never recovered. The lighthouse was built 7 years later, in part as a response to the tragedy. But older stories persist, stories that predate the lighthouse, the shipwreck, and the colonial settlement of the shoals. The Abenaki people avoided White Island. They called it by a name that early English settlers translated imperfectly as the Watcher's Rock. Fragmentary accounts from the 17th century describe a light seen on the island long before any European structure stood there, a pale glow that fishermen learned to avoid rather than follow. A minister named Cotton Mather, writing in 1694, recorded a story told to him by a sailor who had passed the Isles of Shoals at night. He did see upon the southernmost rock a light most strange and cold, which did beckon him toward the deeps. But he was a godly man and knew the works of the adversary, and so he turned his vessel away and made for the safety of the mainland. He did say to me that the light had a hunger to it, that it wished him ill, and would have drawn him to his doom had he not resisted its call. 3 centuries later, the light still burns. The White Island Lighthouse remains standing, maintained as a historical landmark by preservation groups who visit during daylight hours to paint its walls and repair its roof. No one stays after dark. No one has tried to spend a night in the tower since 1991, when a volunteer from the Lighthouse Society attempted to document the phenomenon from inside the lantern room. She reported seeing nothing unusual. The lantern room remained dark throughout the night. Her cameras captured only the ordinary view of ocean and stars. But the following morning, her boat was found drifting 2 miles southeast of the island, her anchor line severed cleanly at the waterline. She was aboard, unharmed but profoundly disoriented. She had no memory of raising anchor, no memory of starting the engine, no memory of anything after midnight. Her vessel had been heading directly toward the hole. The lighthouse keeper's log from 1873 contains an entry that the Preservation Society has never published. It was written by a man named Josiah Cobb, who tended the light for 11 years. The lamp is lit and burning true, but I have seen on certain nights another light, one that burns in no lamp I have tended. It is pale and cold, and it does not welcome ships. It calls to them, and what it calls them toward is not a harbor, but a grave. Cobb served at White Island until 1879, when he resigned his position without explanation and moved inland to Concord. He never returned to the coast. He never spoke of the lighthouse again. The light he tended was decommissioned in 1987. The other light, the one that calls but does not welcome, that guides but does not save, has never stopped burning. And somewhere in the darkness, 4 miles southeast of White Island, the hole waits at the bottom of the sea, patient, hungry, lit by a beacon that no one should follow, but that some cannot resist.